It is the soul of Reverend Brian Hession that stands out most in the few scattered remnants of his legacy. A faded photograph here, a tattered correspondence there, a yellowed newspaper clipping, a roll of 8mm film, his faded image on a long-forgotten television show, a Hollywood movie from the golden era, an aged pamphlet about cancer, a weathered book in a charity shop, a fragment of his voice hidden behind the static of a BBC radio show.
And he, bearing his cross, went forth.
Reverend Hession is in many ways a puzzle box with only a couple of pieces left in it. But in those few remaining pieces, the soul of Reverend Brian Hession is striking, relevant. Perhaps Reverend Hession summed up his life best in a few simple words, scrawled messily on the front page of a book, above an autograph that no one would recognise today. Whatever our problems in life, never let them lick you. He journeyed from a small London suburb all the way to Hollywood and back again, never deviating from his mission. Sometimes battling for God, sometimes battling for his life. But in the beginning, he was just another kid in Hendon. The London borough of Hendon was quite a place to be in the pre-war era of the early 20th century. Ascendant and hopeful, the area would soon become a hub of the aviation industry, home to Hendon Aerodrome, led forward by the renowned aviation pioneer Claude Graham White.
Claude Graham White was certainly a showman. He was a fan of speed, basically. So naturally, when the aeroplane became available as a new form of entertainment and a new form of thrill, he turned his attention to those. He was a visionary. He could see how best to exploit this new medium of aviation.
The possibilities were endless, and they were everywhere. In 1909, Brian Hession was born into this cacophony of hard-working dreams and idealistic aspirations. His parents, Colin and Ida Hession, found a home in nearby Golders Green and settled down to start a family. Brian's father, Colin, made good money as a merchant, trading goods with China, often travelling to Shanghai to do so. He learned Chinese culture and Chinese phrases and words, and perhaps even brought a sense of internationalism into the household. Brian's mother, Ida, took care of the home and the general finance of the household, bringing in boarders and easily making ends meet. Along with Brian's older son, Roy, in turn-of-the-century London, life in Hendon was treating the Hessians well. In 1914, though, the world turned to war and life stopped treating anyone well. And as the war ground stubbornly on, Brian's father applied for admission to the regular army, seeking a temporary commission until the end was granted his request and entered the officers' training admission to the Tank Corps. In April of 1918, he sought action in the Tank Corps, but was returned to training for further instruction. Even though the tank battles were still fiercely raging, in October 1918 he was moved to the Chinese Labour Corps, perhaps because his background travelling to China was a good resource there, or possibly the Tank Corps was just too much for him.
It was extremely noisy coming from the engine, extremely loud noises coming from the battlefield. It would be difficult to concentrate, let alone perform any sensible function within the vehicle. Some of the officers actually walking out of their tanks after a battle and committing suicide. Such was the horrible state they found themselves in.
In November 1918, armistice was declared. 3 months later, Colin Hession was discharged from the army on a 4A status, regular discharge. In a perfect world, Colin would have returned to his home at St John's Road in Golders Green, in the shadow of the aerodrome, and moved on, chasing his post-war dream. But like so many soldiers returning from the Great War, the post-war dream proved elusive to Colin Hession.
Grandfather had an unmentionable illness, and I wasn't told about the cause of his death until I was first, second year medical student. So this was a skeleton in the family cupboard, but he wasn't alone in coming back from China with a disease which was prevalent amongst the ladies of, well, anyway, there were prostitutes, obviously. I'm trying to think of a better word, but the disease did progress to the third stage. We hardly ever see it now, GPI, general paralysis of the insane, or tertiary syphilis.
General paralysis of the insane was what many historians now understand to be neurosyphilis. So this is the final stage of untreated syphilis, which can occur anywhere between 10 and 15 years after the initial syphilitic infection. The symptoms of general paralysis were very varied, and they were both mental and physical. So people would be confused, they might have particular delusions, particular hallucinations, but they also had very marked physical symptoms like tremors, fits, unable to walk properly. And as the disease progressed, as the name suggests, general paralysis, they would become less and less able to actually be involved with any kind of physical activity. So many patients would end their days simply laid in an asylum bed, usually.
But in the first instance, the symptoms weren't that different from a regular asylum lunatic, if you like. I mean, the symptoms of classic madness.
General paralysis was something that you could often link to various things at once. So you might say that a patient's general paralysis was caused by their hereditary disposition, but that might also interact with a physical injury. What you often see in some of the records is that general paralysis is attributed to an amalgamation of causes. So you could say that it was brought on by a physical injury like head injury, and that acted as a catalyst.
It was generally a very stigmatised diagnosis. There was a whole sort of moral sort of armoury behind it.
After the war, Colin's mental and physical condition deteriorated, and as his situation became more dire, he was admitted to the Knapsbury Mental Asylum. There were many families in the UK that found themselves after the war suddenly confronted with the challenges of this sort of mental illness. While GPI was slowly becoming more widely recognised as a biological ailment, not simply madness, the public and the military administrators could be less than sympathetic.
And the idea that stress or life circumstances had anything to do with it was derided. As the traditional position was that it was the fault of the individual. But there was a school of thought, a medical school of thought, which produced evidence that stress of battle or stress in other circumstances could play a role in triggering GPI. One doesn't want to exaggerate this and say that it altogether lost its stigma, but alternative positions were given a hearing.
Horrendous stigma, particularly for a normal middle-class family. It was totally unmentionable. It was indicative of sin and shame, and did die in the hospital, unknown and unseen by his children.
Asylums were still very scary places. I'm not saying that children would have been forbidden to enter, but they certainly wouldn't have been encouraged.
In April 1922, Second Lieutenant Colin Hession passed away at Knapsbury Mental Hospital at the age of 42, marked defective, with his cause of death listed as general paralysis of the insane, many months. Another sad ghost story left to haunt the streets and back alleys of London. As he lay dying in Knapsbury, Colin swore to his wife Ida that he left her a soldier's will, implying that there were untold riches left behind for her. Ida wrote letters to the military, but no soldier's will for Colin Hession was ever found. Perhaps just another delusion suffered by a dying soldier in the painful grips of GPI. Things must have seemed bleak to Brian. Nevertheless, life would soon prove that even profound obstacles would not deter young Brian from following his dreams with a biblical tenacity. In some ways, post-war Hendon made the perfect stomping ground for a rebellious youth like Brian Hession. Home to the first air displays hosted annually by the victorious Royal Air Force, including a massive war victory display in 1919 when Brian was just 10 years old. Living within walking distance of the airfield must have been inspiring to Brian. Self-described as anti-God at the time and the young son of a widowed mother, Brian was filled with mischief, and there were plenty of places to find it. He was educated first at the renowned St John's School, Leatherhead, and later attended the prestigious Aldenham School, where he specialised perhaps more in dissent than study.
If you read accounts of boys and men looking back on their time at British public schools in the 19th and 20th century, it's absolutely mind-boggling, and it's really tragic, both for the mothers and fathers and the young boys being sent away to a boarding school, and they're not supposed to cry, and their mother's not supposed to cry, and they're not supposed to be upset or show any pain or weakness. And you read these school stories from the 19th and 20th century of this, really, to my very sensitive modern eyes, incredibly brutal institutions where you were taught the classic kind of cliches about boys don't show their feelings, boys don't cry. This was the attitude. And there are many people who look back on their time there with some pain, I think.
But at the age of 14, Brian and his older brother Roy attended Christian camp in Dorset during the school holidays, sponsored by the Children's Special Service Mission. A free camp, these were the only kind of trips away their mother could afford. The camps were small and heavily focused on Christianity, but Brian enjoyed them, mostly because it was time away from boarding school. This is where he first met Bishop John Taylor Smith. Bishop Taylor Smith had spent years in Africa as Bishop of Sierra Leone, a witness to classic British colonialism. He was later named as Bishop for the UK's armed forces, serving as Chaplain General over the entire British military during World War I. He struggled immensely to find enough chaplains to assist in easing the pain of the massive amounts of frightened, injured or dying soldiers. He was no stranger to pain and grief and death. For years, the bishop participated in the camps arranged by the Children's Special Service Mission, coordinating outings with young people, many of whom had lost their fathers in the war and were surviving difficult post-war years. It was at these camps that the two Hession boys were meaningfully exposed to sports and participated in water polo, winning championships and building confidence. The effect of Bishop John Taylor Smith on Brian Hession was substantial and long-lasting in many ways. The bishop never wrote any books himself, but became somewhat renowned for observations and witticisms that he used in conversation and scrawled in the personal Bible that he carried with him throughout his life. Upon his death, the bishop left his Bible to one of his students, Percy O'Roofe, who compiled and published some of these observations in two separate books that drew significant public interest at the time. Yet it's the actual pages of the bishop's Bible itself that reflect the texture of the bishop's words, the detailed notes, the carefully drawn fingers pointing out this text or that. Without writing a biography, the bishop's Bible itself in its marginalia leaves behind a clear picture of the bishop's philosophy and teachings. For example, Proverbs 6:22 reads, "When thou goest, it shall lead thee, and when thou sleepest, it shall keep thee, and when thou awakest, it shall talk with thee." In the border next to this, Bishop Taylor Smith wrote his own impressions from this verse.
God's law, to help when conscious, unconscious, and semi-conscious.
And in the book of Daniel, when Daniel has a vision of 4 horned creatures visiting him, he does not hesitate to ask who they are and what they mean. Bishop Taylor Smith admired this intellectual curiosity, noting that
it is our duty to enquire and search for that which we do not understand.
Brian Hession was slowly becoming determined to live a life that unequivocally demonstrated the way in which he interpreted Bishop Taylor Smith's words. Regardless of one's circumstances, it is a godly duty to inquire. It is a godly duty to search for what we do not understand. Building on the lessons he learned from Bishop Taylor Smith, Brian Hession, in his final years at Aldenham, found himself drawn to the clergy, a path his older brother Roy would eventually also follow. The appeal of the church to her children did not altogether please their mother.
A widow's son going to be a parson is ridiculous. There's no money in it.
Nevertheless, in chasing his dreams and aspirations, in time Brian would prove to be, above all, tenacious, whether he had money or not.
In the early 20th century, I think it was perfectly possible to feel that it was a move upwards if you came from a modest background. And the church at large, as a social organisation, was very conscious of class, background, education, and those other properties. There was a strong sense that the Church of England did represent the established religion, and therefore to be a priest of such a church represented a move, one might say, into the centre of society, because everyone lives in a parish and there is a priest for each parish, or there largely is in this period, and therefore it's not simply a question of whether you're moving up, it's a question of whether you're moving into the centre, whether you're in a sense becoming a public presence. Your home was a place in which people came for meetings. Private life was in many ways rather difficult to maintain, and many parish priests would find that they automatically hobnobbed with the higher levels of society around them because they were recognisable to them.
Brian worked hard at school and earned a scholarship to Christ's College, Cambridge. He performed well, and in 1931 he earned his Bachelor of Arts in History with honours. During these years, the young Brian Hession continued working with the Children's Special Service Mission, working as a youth leader at beach and skiing outings like the ones he'd attended a few years earlier. He advocated the concept of open confessions and became a leader of the movement at Cambridge, a sportsman with a spiritual side. Hession also served as the honorary assistant treasurer and assistant secretary of the Cambridge University Swim Club. Hession appears to have introduced a series of somewhat grandiose resolutions. These included a great gala in the summer that was to include star celebrities performing, such as Olympian swimmer Joyce Cooper and the prestigious Travelling Mermaid Club. He proudly and boldly signed his name to this unique set of resolutions. Even in his youth, Hession was showing signs of his character as an ambitious showman. While at Cambridge, Brian took courses on medical skills with the thought that such skills could be helpful should he choose to participate in missionary work abroad. Many of these lectures concluded with a film presentation of a medical procedure for instructive purposes. The sessions were wildly popular with overflowing crowds and immediately sparked Brian's first interest in film. It was a love affair that would last the rest of his life. In 1933, Hession became a curate at St Margaret's Church, Lee, in South London. Serving in the Victorian Church and surrounded by the graves of the wealthy and intellectual, including 3 astronomers royal, one of whom, Edmund Halley, must have had a particular influence on Brian.
Edmund Halley was famous for what's called Halley's Comet now, and he had to travel to the southern hemisphere to work this out. He travelled there really quite young, and he quit his time in Oxford, the university where he was, and of course, I don't know, he became a bit unhappy with his time there, and it didn't quite work out for him, so he kind of left and said, I'm going to do my own thing, and off he went to the southern hemisphere and tracked various planets and astro bodies, and eventually came up with quite a long thesis, quite a complicated thesis about the movements of planets, and sent it back to the king. So bypassed the system, really, whereupon the king said, give that man a master's.
But there were more than just the ghosts of greatness past that would influence Brian at St Margaret's. The vicar of St Margaret's during Hession's curate years was Canon Frank Gillingham.
Well, he was rector here for in a period pre-war, and I think through the wartime as well, and became really quite well known as a preacher as much as anything in the church here. So this place would be filled with 600 people at one service, and then that would finish, and another couple of hundred people would be waiting outside ready to come in for the next one. So he had this reputation about him. The other reputation he had was as a cricketer. And he was the first one to give the cricket commentary on radio for Test cricket in this country. So that's quite a little sort of achievement, you could say. That's all in addition to his being a rector of the church. But in the kind of folk lore of English church history, cricket and and the church and clerics sometimes are kind of put together. And he would be a starring example of that.
It was at this time that Hession formed the Night Film Club, his first foray into the new medium of cinema, hosting evenings of religious films and attracting a younger audience to the church. Gillingham had made a lasting impact on Brian. He had finally found his voice. Moreover, Brian's life was changing in other ways. He began to date Joyce Cooper, the young Olympic swimmer who he'd hoped would appear at a Cambridge Swim Club gala. By this time, Miss Cooper was a star in her own right, and her celebrity status was so high that it earned her a place in the newsreels.
Well, it's a great race, and I can hardly say how pleased I am to have won it.
Because they were regarded at the time as a bit of a celebrity, glamorous couple. And I think they've probably featured in the press quite a bit at the time, and probably in Tatler and so forth.
Brian seemed to be a kindred spirit to Joyce. She herself was an outspoken dissenter from the beginning, decrying various Olympic rules and the manner in which the UK Olympic team was treated. The relationship between Hession and Cooper grew more serious. Soon the Daily Mirror announced their engagement on its front page. Again, it looked as though Brian was closing in on his dream, but it was not to be, not on this path at least. The newspapers would soon announce that by May 1934, Joyce Cooper was engaged to another man, John Badcock, a well-known rugby player for Oxford University and an Olympic medalist. The two went on to have a son, and Joyce retired from swimming. She took it up again a few years later and found herself missing the competition. Nevertheless, it was not to be. Decades later, Cooper would reminisce on her regrets that she ended her swimming career prematurely.
I went down to London and thought I was swimming faster than I had ever done. One day 2 French girls in the swimming world said, "It is criminal. You are much faster than when you were beating the best." Of course, I would have liked to have found out for myself, but my husband didn't like it.
Such is the way of dreams. Some are left behind with tinges of regret, others are chased forever. By this time it was already clear that Brian Hession was a determined dream chaser. The stigma around a broken engagement might have slowed down anyone at that time. As Reverend Hession noted years later, "The clammy, evil imaginings of the depressed mind in the middle of the night are hard to shake off and remind me of the fungus which hangs from the trees in the swamps of Louisiana. Only those who have experienced the evil and dark flights of fancy in the mind can understand the devastating effect that they can have on our happiness." But Brian Hession was not one to allow darkness to slow him down. By the next year he had met a new woman, Mary Scarr, known to her friends and family as Molly. The two began to see each other, and Brian never looked back. The promise of a new and open road lay ahead of them. In the early 1930s, the Church of England was beginning to take serious note of the film industry, Brian Hession's great passion. It saw the potential value of the medium in a religious context, but did not seem to fully understand it. It was concerned about the possible negative effects on the morals of England, but also seemed to be aware of its power and wondered whether it should attempt to control it, utilise it, or both.
I think in the 1930s and 40s, there was a lot of scepticism by the church, which is why you had the Production Code, you had the Hayes Office Code, you had the Catholic Legion of Decency. You had a sense that the church needed to control what filmmakers were doing, where it was thought that the cinema was competing for the souls of as it was often thought in a lot of the literature at the time, gullible people. The cinema was going to corrupt the mindset, particularly of younger people. You even had a papal encyclical from 1936, which was an attempt to try and say, well, we need to ensure that films are good and wholesome.
The Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Lang in particular, was interested in the possibility of some kind of national film committee that not only participated in the substance and, where necessary, censorship, but was also involved in finding and endorsing films that it considered appropriate.
Cosmo Gordon Lang, who was born in 1864, was someone who in this period was making his way rather cautiously through the new landscapes of the middle 20th century, and sometimes doing so reluctantly. So he's not in many ways a natural innovator in the areas in which Brian Hession finds himself. But of course he exercises a considerable superintending presence as far as the life of the church itself is concerned. I think the important thing to say about Lang is that he's complex, he's sophisticated, he's extremely bright, he's very aware of what's going on around him. He has quite an idealistic, even a romantic sense of justice, though often it seems in the period in which we're looking to be rather depleted and even slightly sceptical. He's not automatically particularly unhappy with innovations, and he's not actually automatically unhappy with the cinema as a medium, or the idea of introducing the works of the theatre to the life of the church.
The church set a date, May the 17th, 1935, to host the first official meeting between the church under an umbrella title that would be known as the Cinema Christian Council.
The influence of the church in British public life in this period is very considerable indeed, and in many respects fundamental. One only has to look at the early history of an organisation like the BBC to see that religion is given a tremendously important place within the development of its programmes and its priorities.
And it was in this atmosphere, where no one had quite yet agreed to what the church's role in film should be, that Brian Hession, still a young and determined curate, caught word of the impending meeting in May 1935 and immediately concluded that he knew the proper role of the church in film, and that religious films and film strips were the future.
Well, I remember Brian as a filmmaker, and he got me quite interested. He was producing this material in the name of Dawn Trust. He would send me these little capsules with, for a 10-year-old, were quite exciting to see these, pull out these strips of 35mm film and look at them in the light, and they were quite envied at my school because nobody else had anything quite like this.
The idea was so perfect, in fact, that Brian Hession skipped every level of bureaucratic scrutiny and went straight to the top, the Archbishop of Canterbury himself. Writing on a letterhead from the Knights Film Club, St Margaret's, Lee, and identifying himself as a curate to the well-known Reverend Gillingham, a young Hessian claimed in his letter that he had been asked by the Bishop of Croydon to help on the film committee, and Brian requested a personal meeting with the Archbishop himself, going so far as to offer to bring a projector to show the Archbishop his own films. However, the correspondence ended up not with the Archbishop, but with his deputy chaplain, Alan Don.
Alan Don was Archbishop Lang's chaplain and secretary, and he served Lang devotedly for much of his primacy. But I think somebody like Alan Don would have seen that he represented something of a filter between the Archbishop and the world, and Lang himself would have used Alan Don in exactly that way. So the place of Don in the equation is to help Lang find the right sources of information and secure the most responsible sources of advice. Of course, Don's own opinions will be part of that mix, but the role of Don in the equation was not to be an expert, certainly not to be a guru of any kind, but to help Lang put together essentially an empirical method that drew from recognisable sources of authority and achieved the right view.
Chaplain Don did not appear pleased with Brian's blatant breach of the church's protocol, going over the head of the entire church bureaucracy to address the Archbishop directly.
The Archbishop of Canterbury has received your letter of May 3rd. He is afraid that he has not a moment of time between now and May 17. The meeting of May 17th is of a preliminary nature, and your name was not one of those suggested by the Bishop of Croydon for that occasion.
What Brian probably did not know is that the Bishop of Croydon had already recommended that the Archbishop extend an invitation to the committee to the Reverend Gilbert Shaw, which had been accepted. It would not be the last time Shaw ascended to a position coveted by Brian.
Well, Gilbert Shaw is a significant figure in his own day, but in many ways he's significant as an example of Christian social conscience, an interest in the work of religious orders, a heightened and expressive relationship with Christian spirituality, as it might be found on paper and in books. So he's one of those very creative individualists at work within the general fabric of the Church of England in this period. He doesn't have an immense reputation, he doesn't have a high office, but he's very much a public presence.
Nevertheless, Brian seemed to move on. He soon married Molly, and in September 1935 joined the Royal Air Force on a short service commission. He would serve as a squadron leader and chaplain near London in the RAF unit at Halton. Life refused to remain calm or tranquil for Brian. In mid-1936, while driving his car near Halton, Brian hit and killed a motorcyclist who was riding without lights or a helmet. According to a witness, the rider, who had only one eye, had not stopped or looked before running through an intersection, causing his motorcycle combination to collide with Brian's car. An inquest was held and Brian was not charged. The verdict was death by misadventure. The incident had a serious impact on the Reverend, however. Within 2 months he'd resigned his commission with the RAF and accepted a position as vicar to a parish in Aylesbury at Holy Trinity, Walton, starting in the first weeks of 1937. Soon Reverend Hession was named chaplain to the Mayor of Aylesbury and was quickly becoming well known in his new home.
Yes, Reverend Brian Hession was one of the ministers here. He came in 1937, so the church was nearly 100 years old then. He left a great impression with the people he ministered to. Very much, let's get to know everybody and then we won't have any strangers.
At his new church, the Reverend Hession almost immediately continued his quest to develop and grow a congregation through the medium of film. In his very first week, he held a church social gathering that included a film presentation of his wedding to his wife Mary, as well as other local footage that he'd shot, as an example of how the church would begin to incorporate film into its services and philosophy. Soon enough, Reverend Hession would be showing full-length talkie films to his congregation, films which had been approved by the church as suitable and with sound moral teachings, such as The Passing of the Third Floor Back. He sometimes rented out public theatres in Aylesbury and surrounding areas, drawing large crowds as well as attention from the media.
He certainly toured the country with a projector and a screen. I mean, it's small beer nowadays, but he would set up in a church, and every night for 3 or 4 nights people that hadn't seen a great big screen in a church before. The town would get plastered with posters, and he would give an introduction and a talk before and after the film. So, yes, I made several trips from my boarding school to this church in Ramsgate to see him doing his stuff, where I met my first girlfriend, Wendy Smith, whatever happened to her. But no, I just remember sort of going to sing and holding hands, which was a very exciting thing for a young boy at that stage, with Wendy Smith, yes.
In many ways, Reverend Hession seemed to be modelling his career trajectory after famed British film mogul Arthur Rank.
J. Arthur Rank realised how difficult it is to communicate. And he set up
Nevertheless, the films were extremely expensive to produce, and Del Giudice was forced to sell a controlling interest to Arthur Rank.
Showing films.
The Rank organisation
soon
clamped down on budgets,
watching the films,
and
they would
Del
sit
Giudice's
still
creative freedom.
and engage in a way that they
soon
didn't when
attempted
he
to
was
start a
teaching
new
them in
production
Sunday school.
company and served as the administrator
he became
or
very
presenter
interested
for a few
in
movies.
the film industry.
The financial challenges
within
proved overwhelming.
10 years, he
By the
owned
time
studios,
Reverend Hession joined his friend at his
cinemas,
long-term
and distribution
residence
rights,
at Italy's
totaling,
prestigious Excelsior
£50
Hotel in
million
Rapallo, Del Giudice described himself as
influence in every
desperate,
area
and
of
exhausted.
the business.
The hotel was such a exquisite, success and story Del must have been Giudice inspiring was to the receiving many Reverend. glamorous visitors. Meanwhile, the Cinema
Bergman,
Christian
Roberto
Council was
Rossellini,
not progressing as
Peter
Archbishop
Ustinov.
Lang had hoped. While Hession's films were attracting larger and larger congregations, the council began to look for new members, and in March 1937, the tenacity that had characterised Hession from his lean days in Hendon paid off. He was finally accepted onto the council, the very church organisation that Alan Don had scooted him away from in 1935. In his eyes, at least, he was now approaching the same heights as Gilbert Shaw and even Arthur Rank. And there was no reason to believe that the Reverend's trajectory was headed anywhere but upwards. He did not wait long to take advantage of his new membership. Just a month after becoming a member of the council, Reverend Hession wrote directly again to the Archbishop of Canterbury. He introduced himself as a member of the council and invited the Archbishop to a sermon in which a full-length talkie film would be shown. Furthermore, Reverend Hession asked the Archbishop to give the service his blessing, as well as a written commendation that could be published. He also requested that the Archbishop say a few words at one of the services. The council itself heard of Reverend Hession's request and forwarded its thoughts to Chaplain Don, as articulated by the council's secretary, T.H. Baxter.
It is proposed to hold a religious film festival at the Metropole Cinema on June the 6th, 13th and 20th. The Reverend Brian Hession, who I think you know of old, is a very impulsive young man whom we are trying to keep in hand and make use of his energy and enthusiasm.
Because the event had already been advertised and many people had accepted invitations, the council had little choice but to pass resolutions to approve the showing or risk angering Reverend Hession's growing audience. But it was clear that the council was losing patience with Hession's growing tendency to act first and beg forgiveness second. Baxter and the council were intent on tamping down at least one of the Reverend Hession's plans.
Hession turns up with some printed notepaper, and I wonder how far you feel it would be right to put the Archbishop of Canterbury's name on this effort. It is also proposed to send out an invitation card on which we shall say, "The Archbishop of Canterbury requests the pleasure of your attendance at a religious film service, etc." Or rather, I suggest it should be, "The Cinema Christian Council, etc." But Hession says that's not enough.
Not unexpectedly, Chaplain Don was firm and unequivocal in his response. No. In no uncertain terms, Chaplain Don responded to the Reverend's requests to both the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Council quite simply.
As to the specific requests which you made in your letter of April the 7th, His Grace is afraid that he cannot comply with any of them.
But Brian Hession had not yet gone as far as he could with his evangelical campaign for the widespread distribution of religious film. After he'd been on the council for barely 3 months, in May and June 1937, Reverend Hession sent 2 correspondences directly to Queen Mary herself, seeking her patronage for his film company Dawn Trust. After all, if Edmund Halley could approach the king directly 200 years earlier, Reverend Hession could surely approach the Queen directly now. Queen Mary seemed somewhat befuddled by Hession, and Buckingham Palace sought guidance from the Archbishop of Canterbury on the matter, who promptly delegated it to Chaplain Don. Don remained unamused with Reverend Hession's bravado and disinterest in proper church protocol. In his response, Chaplain Don reflected on the Reverend Hession's character.
In the Archbishop of Canterbury's opinion, Mr. Hession is to be commended for his enthusiasm and enterprise. At the same time, the matter is still in a more or less experimental stage, and he does not think that it would be advisable for Her Majesty the Queen to be identified with it until it has been put to further test. As for Mr. Hession himself, he is an enthusiastic and somewhat pushing young man, and His Grace does not think it would be altogether good for him to have Her Majesty's patronage until he has given proof being the kind of man who thoroughly merits encouragement in high quarters.
No further talks between Buckingham Palace and the Reverend appear to have occurred, for the time being at least. (1937 and 1938 would prove to be eventful years for Reverend Brian Hession. Having secured a seat as a member of the Cinema Christian Council, Brian immediately went to work. He was diligent and made sure he stayed current with all the literature the church published regarding film.
The main difficulty is there are very few religious films available. I am thinking of the attempts to set forth the Christian gospel to the masses of the people in this country.
But reaching the masses throughout the United Kingdom was exactly the vision that Reverend Brian Hession had been evangelising for many years now. And the church's observation that there weren't many religious films available was just another challenge to be confronted and surmounted. In March 1937, at the meeting of the council in which Reverend Hession was first introduced and made a council member, they held a discussion regarding potential films with sound moral religious themes that could be endorsed and broadcast by the church. One film in particular was raised as suitably meritorious but was dismissed as having been lost years ago, From the Manger to the Cross. This was a 1912 silent film directed by Sidney Alcott that depicted the life of Jesus Christ, and at the time was immensely popular and critically acclaimed. It had not been presented in years, and no surviving copies were known to exist. Reverend Hession decided immediately that he would travel to the ends of the earth to locate this film if necessary. With some hard work and luck, the Reverend located R. Henderson Bland, the actor who had portrayed Jesus Christ in the 1912 movie. Bland knew the film was missing, but was convinced it could be found.
I told Reverend Hession that I thought the film From the Manger to the Cross was still in existence, and that if one were on the spot in New York, it might be possible to trace its whereabouts.
And it was soon agreed that the two would travel to America, find From the Manger to the Cross, bring it back to England, and kick-start the British religious film movement. In preparation for the trip, Reverend Hession made sure to maximise the public interest and anticipation for what he promised would be something truly special and unique, making headlines describing his secret mission. And with that dramatic parting announcement, Reverend Hession prepared to sail to New York for the first time. He was on a quest, a treasure hunt. But before he could set off on his international trek, Reverend Hession had to defend himself one more time, this time performing the Church of England Film Society without bothering to obtain permission from the Church of England to do so.
It's always very difficult to talk about something called the Church of England, because the Church of England is really an accumulation of organisations which achieve some sort of overall coherence. So there is actually, in many ways, an openness there, and at the same time a quality of vulnerability, because somebody like Archbishop Lang won't want the Church of England as a name to be taken in vain. And at the same time, it's still very difficult to be very clear about what it is. It's not a corporation in the obvious sense. So the question of moral and legal rights of possession and identity don't really apply. Everything in that sense is a negotiation to achieve a model of responsibility which actually works largely because it doesn't embarrass anybody. And this meant that a figure like Lang is going to look to certain established organisations as the embodiments of reliability and responsibility, and by the same token view somebody who tries to work outside them as being, well, just that, an outsider, somebody who might actually be not quite responsible and not quite predictable.
Again, T.H. Baxter, the council's secretary, notified Chaplain Don of this egregious breach of church etiquette.
The Executive Council were more than surprised at Hession's move and wondered whether an individual priest could take on himself to form a Church of England organisation.
Don showed what some would consider substantial restraint when he communicated his displeasure at these developments.
While His Grace doubts whether he has any legal power to prevent individuals launching societies under the name of the Church of England, he thinks that it is scarcely appropriate that a society with that somewhat grandiloquent name should be inaugurated without any previous consultation with him or with the Cinema Christian Council.
It's not as though one's looking at an authoritarian organisation which has a very clear and applied sense of power over what is going on, but as a presence it's undoubtedly insistent, authoritative and ubiquitous.
Reverend Hession was surprisingly aggressive in his responding tone to the chaplain, not being one to hesitate to confront or dispute authority, stating he felt that neither you nor His Grace could fully appreciate or understand the circumstances and workings of the Cinema Christian Council. Nevertheless, Reverend Hession, perhaps having enough savvy not to cross this line formally, agreed to change the name of the society from the Church of England Film Society to the more generic Church Film Society. Having resolved that controversy for the moment, Hession continued on his quest, sailing on the SS Laconia with Mr. Henderson Bland. Reverend Hession and Mr. Henderson Bland reached America and immediately began their search. The first few days must have been eye-opening, with the busy city streets outpacing even the frenzy of London. It was the Reverend's first trip to New York, but it's unlikely that he spent much time sightseeing. Mr. Henderson Bland's American contacts appeared to have been dead ends, people who'd disappeared years earlier. The international trip had been long and arduous, but it was not in Reverend Hession's nature to retreat. He soldiered on and eventually found an acceptable copy of the film's negative. Hession immediately went to work. He added new scenes to the movie to modernise it, as well as his own commentary quoting strictly from the Bible. With his typical flair for publicity, Reverend Hession made sure that his new project got plenty of press attention, perhaps too much attention. The Archbishop of Canterbury's deputy chaplain Alan Don soon learned of the film and was lukewarm about endorsing the Reverend's work.
I confess to being a little doubtful about the Reverend Brian Hession. He launched the Church Film Society in the first instance under the name of the Church of England Film Society, without any reference to the Cinema Christian Council. Hession is undoubtedly a young man of enterprise and enthusiasm, but I am a little doubtful as to his discretion.
But none of this was enough to remove From the Manger to the Cross from public viewings, and Don seemed increasingly interested in doing just that. It was not long before he figured out a compelling way to try. A year earlier, Don had occasion to be an arbiter over the church's potential censorship of two films, the French art film Golgotha and the American musical The Green Pastures. While the two films were presented in starkly different styles, there was one element they had in common. They both depicted the figure of God, albeit in radically different ways. Golgotha was in the more traditional style of movies and represented biblical figures as white and within the accepted realm of what these figures looked like. The Green Pastures, remarkably for its time, featured an all-African-American cast playing biblical figures, including God. The church received complaints from a variety of corners about both films, some advocating for and some against the censorship of one or the other, or both. In November 1936, the church decided to censor Golgotha and permit The Green Pastures, though for reasons that, from today's viewpoint, seem rather suspect.
His Grace thinks there is a real difference between the two films, in that one is a film which centres around a personal representation of our Lord himself, while the other simply represents a childlike conception of the deity, as pictured in the minds of a childlike people.
It's difficult now to miss the double standard in the censorship board's decision. Regardless of this unfortunate reality of the world's recent past, at the time Chaplain Don exploited the odd distinction to his favour, such that any broadcast of Reverend Hession's reworked talkie version of From the Manger to the Cross would prove difficult, if not impossible. In December 1937, with the Archbishop of Canterbury's consent, Chaplain Don approved the request of the Cinema Church Council to form a viewing panel to advise as to possible films for support and approval by the church. Almost immediately, Chaplain Don heard criticism from the Archbishop of Canterbury himself, who had sought the advice of a friend, Miss Rosamond Essex, the film expert on the Church Times staff and also a good friend of Chaplain Don. Miss Essex was not one to mince words.
As to the film From the Manger to the Cross, she pointed out that the photographs were about 20 years old. Good then, but not so good now, when talk and movement have to be combined. Miss Essex considered that by acceding to Hession's request to boost this particular film, I would be doing something to help a film which was not first class, though fairly good.
Chaplain Don immediately forwarded on the Archbishop's thoughts to Reverend Hession on the film.
After thinking carefully over the whole situation, His Grace has regretfully come to the conclusions that he cannot do what you request.
The Reverend immediately sent a very stern letter to Chaplain Don in response to the church declining to support From the Manger to the Cross. His words were angry and raw, reminding the church that it had approved the silent version of the film back in 1912, and therefore there was no reason for the church to withdraw its prior endorsement. The Archbishop immediately replied personally, and in words that can only be described as blunt.
I am very sorry, but I confess not wholly surprised that this difficulty has occurred. I thought you might be too confident in believing that as your film was passed as a silent film some years ago, there would be no need of any further passing, now that it has been transformed into a talking film. I am at present not satisfied as to the desirability of films being exhibited in public cinema halls, in which our Lord is personally represented.
Chaplain Don followed up with Reverend Hession upon returning to the church the following day, reinforcing the church's position that the figure of Jesus Christ on film could not be supported by the church. He also stated that the church simply could not make an exception in this case, not only because it could lead to other exceptions, but to avoid the appearance of impropriety.
Obviously, His Grace would expose himself to a great deal of misunderstanding if it became known that he had connived at an exception being made in the case of a film owned by one of his own clergy.
Reverend Hession continued to be relentless, writing to Don and claiming that his assistant Baxter was looking for a battle out of spite, but that Hession and his supporters were ready to make as much dust as possible and attack either the CCC, the viewing panel, or Baxter. Alan Don tensely agreed to attend a viewing of the film at Fulham Palace, hosted by the Bishop of London, on the 12th of March 1938. The Fulham Palace showing of From the Manger to the Cross must have been quite a sight to behold. Alan Don did indeed attend the viewing, but perhaps most remarkably, Queen Mary herself was in attendance. This appearance would surely raise Reverend Hession's profile enormously. Finally, Hession was displaying his film to the very highest in British society, as he'd always believed was the appropriate place for such a showing.
Now the birth of Jesus Christ was on this wise. The angel Gabriel was sent from God unto a city of Galilee named Nazareth, to a virgin espoused to a man whose name was Joseph, and the virgin's name was Mary. And behold, thou shalt bring forth a son, and shalt call his name Jesus. And she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger. Blind Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, sat by the wayside, begging. He began to cry out and say, Jesus, thou son of David, have mercy upon me. And Jesus answered and said unto him, What wilt thou that I should do unto thee? The blind man said unto him, Lord, that I may receive my sight. Jesus said unto him, Go thy way, thy faith hath made thee whole. And they took Jesus and led him away, and he, bearing his cross, went forth. Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Although Queen Mary declined the previous year to provide patronage to the Reverend Hession, Her Majesty seemed interested in offering him her support. According to Reverend Hession, Queen Mary was deeply impressed and gave her consent that her presence at the viewing could be made public.
Young man, you can make my presence known to the press and public if that will help you at all.
The fact that Queen Mary, consented to see the film, but also, more importantly, consented to have it be known that she had seen the film and approved of it, I think is highly significant. And of course, like throughout this period, there's a slight unrespectability to cinema generally. And so the endorsement of a member of the royal family is absolutely a sort of guarantee that it's respectable.
Despite this public support, just a few days prior to the Fulham Palace viewing, Chaplain Alan Don began a letter campaign asking a variety of bishops what they thought of the idea of depicting the figure of Jesus Christ on film. The response was more or less unanimous: no. The viewing council released its pronouncement on From the Manger to the Cross.
The film, as a representation of the life of our Lord, is thoroughly unsatisfactory.
On this basis, the Entertainment Committee of the London County Council, or LCC, banned the film so that it could not be shown within the city. Chaplain Don invited a representative of the BBC to attend the 12th of March viewing and report back his review. Chaplain Don sought this expert through the BBC's Director of Religion, the Reverend Frederick Ironmonger. The expert he assigned to watch the film was not impressed.
The whole thing struck him as being unworthy of any secular subject, still less of a religious one, and he thought that the taste of the whole thing was not above criticism.
Alan Don, as promised, also attended the film and wrote up 2 pages of notes, none of which were positive.
My impressions of the film may be stated thus. It is poor in quality, photography, and much below modern standards.
Graham Greene, while he worked as a film reviewer for The Spectator magazine, provided a lukewarm analysis, noting that the original footage was from 1912 and that 25 years in film history is like 5 centuries of painting, Green found much in the film to be significant and relevant, particularly the suffering of Christ, comparing it, in 1938, to a Nazi prisoner in the Brown House. He saw the film as an unsentimental reminder of the material horror, the link between the raising of Lazarus and the monkey's paw. Unfortunately, Green concludes that the only false notes are in fact the modern notes, added by Hession.
There are two major differences that happen in that period. One is like a massive change in the ways in which films are edited. Like most films of the 1912 period tend to have an intertitle which describes what's going to happen in the scene, and then the shot is static, and the scene plays out in front of you. By the late 1920s, you have got an editing strategy where you have close-ups, the camera moves around, like somebody looks at something and the camera gives you a close-up of what they're looking at and then cuts back. So like a typical scene, instead of being shot in a single shot, is made up of a whole range of very short shots that dissect the space in film studies terms. That would have been as jarring for audiences in 1938 to see a film shot in the way that a film is shot in 1912 as the introduction of sound. It's a voiceover narration that the Manger of the Cross uses would have felt odd to audiences in 1938.
Despite this, Reverend Hession did not give up. He was a man who knew how to do his research and studied the regulations closely, learning that the LCC only had jurisdiction over inflammable films. The Reverend simply had a non-inflammable copy of the film made, renting private cinemas for viewings. Moreover, there were reports arising in the newspapers that the bishops of Portsmouth, Winchester and Southampton were intending to see and support the film. But when the CCC's Secretary Baxter queried them, each denied they intended even to see it. Baxter reported this fact back to Alan Don, suggesting that the source of these misstatements should be attributed to Hession. Don responded quickly, stating that if this were indeed the case, it would be reprehensible, and made a call to Baxter that we must stick to our guns. The very next day, T.H. Baxter of the council confronted Reverend Hession about his tactics and reported back to Chaplain Don on the gist of the conversation.
Hession and I had a regular set-to at the council meeting yesterday over this wretched film. Hession tried to insinuate that all of the trouble was being caused by one person, namely myself. I was glad that the Bishop of Lichfield put the matter plainly by telling Hession that he supposed that the crux of the matter was that the Cinema Christian Council thought the film was a bad one, while Hession thought it was a good one.
The Bishop of Lichfield hit the nail on the head. Reverend Hession was simply unable to see this movie as anything other than a good one. Indeed, while newspapers publicised the opinion of the council that the film ought not to be shown in public cinemas, this did not stop Reverend Hession from displaying a statement as part of his showing of the film that the Archbishop of Canterbury approved the film. Hession was again admonished by Don.
If this is true, the Archbishop feels bound to point out that it is a most misleading statement, and one which he hopes you will not repeat.
Chaplain Don and Baxter were becoming weary of Reverend Hession and his tendency to make waves. The boycotting of his film then began in earnest. Indeed, even Buckinghamshire County Council, which presided over Reverend Hession's own parish in Aylesbury, declined a request to show the film. Hession went so far as to lease the Grotrian Hall, a run-down cinema that he redubbed the Religious Film Theatre. He began playing the movie non-stop, with occasional other religious films slotted in for balance. The Reverend Hession asked the Archbishop for his blessing of the new theatre and the film. The Archbishop declined.
Owing to the difficulties and complications which seem to be involved in this matter of religious films, I must not give it, to use your words, my blessings and approval.
In his typical fashion, Reverend Hession continued to write to Chaplain Don and the Archbishop, reiterating his request for a meeting and a viewing, pleading with them to give his movie a chance. His tone is quixotic. But at the same time, the Archbishop was also hearing from the general public, who were not always enamoured with Brian's efforts.
In response to the letter from the Reverend Brian Hession in the Times of October 10th, I took my daughter and a friend to the Grotrian Hall yesterday evening to see, as I thought, the passing of the third floor back. He mentioned that this was showing. As it turned out, that film is only to be seen on Sunday afternoon, and the only film showing was From the Manger to the Cross. The historic interest of this film is no doubt great, but to those accustomed to modern standards, the effect is naturally lamentable, and the whole tragically inadequate production, the uncomfortable seats, and generally amateurish element distressed me profoundly. There were 3 other persons in the theatre besides ourselves, and 2 of them went out before us.
By this point, the Archbishop had had enough of the tension between Reverend Hession, Mr. Baxter and Chaplain Don.
His Grace does not feel disposed to do anything further in the matter of Hession.
While Reverend Hession continued to schedule additional viewings of the film where possible, darker and more ominous events were developing that would change everything for everybody. On September the 3rd, 1939, Reverend Hession woke up, prepared himself in the normal course of business and presided over his congregation in Aylesbury for communion, morning prayers and later evensong. It was all diligently recorded in the church register. In careful handwriting in the top right corner of the register page for that date, it was also unobtrusively noted that Germany is at war with Great Britain, Poland and France. Starting in September 1939, Reverend Hession became a wartime vicar.
Well, I think he saw it very much as pointing them towards the Christian hope, pointing them towards eternal life rather than the current troubles. But Brian was also very, very good at looking after people who had personal grief, personal distress. So he'd be very much supportive of anyone who had lost a family member during the war, if they'd been killed on active service or if they died in a bombing raid, say in London. So Brian would have been very, very supportive and caring to anybody who had suffered as a direct result of the hostilities. It's a vicar's job anyway, but in the war he may have presided over more than he had expected to.
Yet Hession remained a strong leader to his parish. His wife Molly served as an air raid precautions ambulance driver, while Brian himself served in the ARP control centre. There is record of only a single film produced by Reverend Hession during the war, Let's Go Inside. With its dark and grim feel, it's an early, primitive example of film noir. It's a reflection on life in a wartime parish and depicts the only known surviving example of one of Reverend Hession's filmed sermons.
Our lesson is taken from the book of the prophet Isaiah. Who hath believed our report, and to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? And your labour for that which satisfieth not. Seek ye the Lord while he may be found. Call ye upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts. And let him return unto the Lord, and he will have mercy upon him. And to our God, for he will abundantly pardon.
The faces of the congregation are stern, sombre. The faces of those scarred by World War I. The faces of those who were losing loved ones in World War II. The faces of those who came back from battle a different person. Reverend Hession tried to make the church a true place of refuge for the tired and the weary. Often the only choir available, a small luxury, a tiny escape from reality, was one heard on the radio or seen in one of Reverend Hession's travelling film services.
Will you surrender yourself here and now to God? He will prove himself a power and a reality in your life. As we sing our last hymn, Abide With Me, may the words as we sing them be a prayer to God from the very bottom of our heart. Let us remain seated and sing.
Abide with me, fast falls the eventide. The darkness deepens, Lord, with me
Hession was part of a wonderful trajectory whereby he saw that films about religion were actually not all that good. And in many cases, he thought, well, I'm going to make better films myself that fit with that particular vision. And in many respects, I'd say he was quite a pioneer.
In 1944, just 2 years after Hession's film was released, Archbishop William Temple appeared in a similar film, Message from Canterbury, with dark noir-like scenes, a congregation affected by the war, followed by a sing-along sermon with lyrics, a sermon from the Archbishop.
Live in the eternal glory of God's grace.
The influence of Hession's style from 1942 on this film seems unmistakable. George Hollering, the director of Message from Canterbury, went on to produce and direct several films, including the feature-length film Murder in the Cathedral, a rendition of T.S. Eliot's verse drama portraying the death of Thomas Becket, which was encouraged by former Archbishop of Canterbury George Bell and supported by the Church. Echoes of Brian's Let's Go Inside may be seen in this film as well.
No faith do I owe to a renegade, and what I owe shall now be paid.
Now to Almighty God, to the Blessed Mary ever Virgin, to the Blessed John the Baptist, the Holy Apostles Peter and Paul, to the Blessed Martyr Denis and to all the saints, I commend my cause and that of the Church.
Clear the air.
Even though Hession may have influenced the films that were increasingly finding support and praise from church experts, he remained unable to crack through the veneer of church credibility. But his work is considered more pioneering today, with some offering comparisons to Martin Scorsese.
I think Hession and Scorsese are very similar in the way that they both came from a faith background, and filmmaking, or film production in the case of Hession, but certainly in the case of Scorsese, film direction, they were very much driven by a faith. It may have been a lapsed faith in the case of Scorsese. Obviously, that wasn't the case with Hession. But it was the drive, it was that which propelled their filmmaking proclivities. There was a sense of inner integrity which drove them on a particular journey, which may not have been to everyone's taste. Film. If Hession was still alive in the 1980s, I suspect he would have been challenged by what Scorsese was doing, because Scorsese was doing something much more critical, something much more subversive, but within the boundaries of Christian theology.
He's also been compared to filmmaker Ed Wood, who perhaps favoured passion over technical perfection.
But like Ed Wood, the thing that he is a showman. You know, he's really good at using every single thing that is available to him to try and push that ambition.
In March of 1942, Archbishop of Canterbury Cosmo Lang resigned his position, and in April, William Temple was named his successor. Archbishop Temple inherited a difficult position. In the same month, Germany began its attacks on cathedral cities, known as the Baedeker raids, named after the German publisher of tour guides. The Luftwaffe vowed to bomb every building in Britain that the Baedeker Guide had awarded 3 stars. The attacks viciously focused on historic churches and cathedrals. In September 1942, the SS Laconia, the same ship that took Hession to America in 1937, was torpedoed, having been converted to a military vessel. Hundreds died during the rescue mission following the strike after US bombers targeted U-boats that were assisting in the rescue. The incident purportedly contributed to the infamous order of German Naval Admiral Dönitz that no survivors of U-boat attacks be assisted. War was everywhere. Nevertheless, Hession decided he had given enough time, 6 months, for Archbishop Temple to settle into his new position, and contacted him to seek an interview and endorsement of his movies. To Brian, religious films were critical to the morale of the people. In this tornado of war, Hession resolutely made his case for Dawn Trust to receive the Archbishop's patronage, writing, "I know I am asking a lot, but I have high hopes for the future of the religious film movement." As was shown in his participation of the 1944 film Message from Canterbury, Archbishop Temple had some interest in film. The Archbishop forwarded the letter to the Bishop of Lichfield, who was one of the church's resident film experts and who had previously shown support for Hession. 4 years on, though, the bishop's support had grown tepid. He gave his frank opinion about Hession to Temple.
"I think I should advise you to go slow with this good man. He is full of fairly good ideas, but is rather the type of young man in a hurry, without any great wealth of wisdom. he has constantly badgered Cosmo about these things. He was always impatient with the Cinema Christian Council, of which he was a member, because the thought that we on that council were too slow and inefficient, and he has rather hived off and has always had schemes of his own.
He also recommended that the Archbishop seek further counsel from the current chairman of the CCC, Dr. Benjamin Gregory, who had similar thoughts on Hession.
Hession is enthusiastic and very hard-working, but is strongly individualistic and finds it very difficult to do teamwork.
Based on this, Temple respectfully declined to take up active association with Hession's organisation. Hession responded with 3 pages of reasons why the Archbishop was given mistaken advice regarding the proper utilisation of film for religious purposes. Temple forwarded this second letter again to the Bishop of Lichfield, saying that he did not want to be a wet blanket to an enthusiast, but continued to hesitate to support Hession's company. The Bishop of Lichfield agreed and also suggested further input on the issue from a film expert, once again the Reverend Gilbert Shaw, who had been appointed to the CCC before Hession and was increasingly being consulted on religious film issues by the Church, a role that Hession dearly sought for himself. No doubt it would have annoyed Hession to know that Gilbert Shaw was commenting on his work to the Archbishop, and the comments were not kind.
I can only give the personal opinion, which I think would be supported by Canon Barker and others, that Hession's record in the past in regard to films is not good. We had great difficulty with him on various committees in which he would not work with anybody else, and he was responsible for putting on films which we did not consider either adequate or desirable as religious films.
Regardless of whether any of the criticisms were accurate or appropriate, they certainly resonated in the mind of Archbishop Temple.
It is certainly clear to me that I ought not to give my name in any way to the Dawn Trust.
On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler killed himself in his Berlin bunker as Russian and US troops closed in on him. Just a few weeks later, the war was over. Reverend Hession celebrated victory the only way he seemed to know how, by making a film. His Dawn Trust Productions released A Letter from Goathorn, a tour of Poole Harbour in Dorset, ostensibly in the form of a spoken letter to an injured soldier whose burnt and broken body would never be able to travel to that picturesque area. The entire movie was narrated by Hession and is strikingly different in theme and mood from his dark 1942 movie Let's Go Inside.
My dear Stern, I've been to write to you for ages, to tell you about our holiday cottage and its romantic countryside. The harbour is studded with islands, whose yellow sandy beaches glisten invitingly in the sun. Poole Quayside, a sight to gladden the heart of any sailing man or small boy, and a reminder that once the men of Poole were so obstinate that King Charles paid a personal visit in an effort to win them over. He was not very successful. Perhaps he spent too long inside. At this point, we passed our Canberra launch with my wife, having trouble with the anchor in a fast-moving tide. We too are soon to learn that it is a case of one hand for yourself and the other for the ship.
Even in this innocuous post-war travelogue film, the Reverend couldn't resist adding just a bit of harmless thrill.
The skipper decides to go about, and we change tack and make for the sheltered harbour before the wind gets worse. With the old water drifter in sight, we know that we are nearing Goathorn, where we're dropping our hook for the night. Here I must end my letter, and hope that one day you will come to Poole Harbour and enjoy a beauty that is for ever England.
As beautiful and calming as Poole was, it was not enough to contain Reverend Hession's ambition. In 1946, he travelled to America for the second time, determined to find success for his religious films. And this time he didn't go to America empty-handed. This time he had a script of his own, The Hand That Drove the Nails, and 100 Reasons Why This Movie Should Be Hollywood's Next Big Thing. Adapted from a 1934 novel by J. Fletcher Ray, The Hand That Drove the Nails was well known at the time. The screenplay was another attempt by the Reverend Hession to produce a big movie depicting the life of Jesus, but this time from a very different perspective, narrated by a vintage adventurer who happened upon a remarkable find. Hession pictured Spencer Tracy playing the main character, or maybe a young Frank Sinatra, and he was determined to travel to America again and convince Hollywood that he was right, and this would be one fantastic film.
As a young man, I studied Aramaic at the university. I spent many hours in the school's old library, mastering the ancient tongue. Soon after completing my studies, the Great War arose and I was called to duty. I was shot on a rainy Italian night and was eventually sent to Rome to convalesce in a small inn. While there, the innkeeper offered me a casket of ancient documents. I was intrigued, and I paid a small pittance for the souvenir, but never bothered to open it. When I finally returned home and opened the casket, I was greeted by a pungent odor. Trembling with excitement, I removed the rolls and found, to my surprise, 3 huge nails, each long and red with rust. Reaching in again, I gasped with horror as I pulled out another object, the darkly stained bones of a man's hand. I read the parchment with a growing trepidation. Only when the dawn stole between the curtains did it fully occur to me. This was the confession of Scipio Marialis, none other than the executioner of Christ. This was the hand that drove the nails.
The exotic vicar filmmaker with his posh English accent, wise words and a script in his lap was just glamorous enough to pass Hollywood and New York muster. He was able to hobnob in the right circles, which included, among others, Roy Rogers, Robert Young, Douglas Fairbanks, and, in a friendship that would last Hession's entire life, Mary Pickford. The American press seemed to pick up quickly on the Reverend and his dashing good looks. He wasn't quite on the front cover of Time magazine, but at least he was in it. Unlike his earlier expedition with Robert Bland Henderson to acquire a copy of From the Manger to the Cross, on this trip Reverend Hession could observe and participate in 1940s Hollywood lifestyle. His relationship with the famed city was both romantic and scornful. In Hession's words, "Hollywood is an atmosphere that gets into your blood when you've lived there and makes you want to go back, to the whirl of the fast-moving traffic, the heat, the crowded churches, and fantastic affairs with swimming pools. And above all, the friendly people, rich or poor. They are all hard workers and determined to enjoy life, even if so many make a mess of it. Success is the thing, as long as you are a success, and to be a success, you have to make a lot of noise." Hession concluded, "Death does not enter into the picture at all, except perhaps in the form of suicide as a way out for some frustrated, disappointed failure." It's clear that Hession's 5-month stay in Hollywood brought to him a feel of the town's soul. Maybe it was in all those crowded churches, maybe those fantastic affairs with swimming pools, maybe it was both. Hession made connections and friends that would prove critical. He managed to secure a meeting in 1946 with the former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who praised his work and even sent letters of recommendation to such notable financiers as Nelson Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller respectfully declined, relying on the advice of one of his associates, Martha Dalrymple, who did not find Reverend Hession's project appealing, reasoning that it had all the makings of a Catholic-Protestant feud. Hession also appeared on the radio, performing portions of his new film with famed English actress turned Hollywood starlet Anna Lee. Moreover, while in Hollywood, Brian served as technical consultant on at least one movie, Jairus' Daughter, a religious tale produced by Cathedral Films. Hession was on set with his trusty Argus Cintar camera on his hip, giving his input on Christian issues from a British perspective to film producer and Cathedral Films founder James K. Friedrich. Though he found no significant investors for his production company Dawn Trust Films, his presence was enough to ruffle the feathers of some competitors. One organisation, the Protestant Film Commission from New York, wrote a letter to Mrs. Roosevelt after learning of one of her letters of recommendation. They wanted Mrs. Roosevelt to know that Reverend Hession was not officially backed by the Church of England and proposed a meeting to introduce her to their own work. Mrs. Roosevelt scrawled a handwritten response to this letter. Its language would have surely pleased Reverend Hession no end.
"I have your letter of October 29th. I liked Mr. Hession and his ideas. I have only given him 1 or 2 recommendations. If he has had any success, I assure you it was on his own merits. I imagine there is room for more than one venture."
Hession returned to England from the US with a reinvigorated fervour for his mission. Once his script sold, he hoped to return to the States, bringing his entire family with him, and planning to open a liaison office that would clear US films for UK distribution. It was time to live a new dream, perhaps the American dream. The script never sold. Still relentless, the Reverend worked hard to establish his name in the industry, writing articles and film criticisms that were published in well-respected trade periodicals such as Sight and Sound and Picturegoer.
I found that it was a very useful piece in which he was looking at the depiction in the United Kingdom of priests. Often they were portrayed as buffoons, Church of England country vicars. In America, he thought that particularly in a Roman Catholic context, there was a much richer sense of portrayal over priests. So his concern was that religion seemed to be putting people off, and he wanted to try and then make films which were serious films, good films, that weren't simply about, and he refers to the nonsense of films about angels in the afterlife.
Brian also continued in his efforts to create a formal position within the church hierarchy for his film work. Archbishop Geoffrey Fisher, having replaced William Temple after his untimely death in 1944, would become the third Archbishop of Canterbury to have Hessians solicit their patronage. Fisher penned his response in a deliberate manner and had no intention to address film on a piecemeal basis.
Quite apart from the fact that I am no particular judge of films, I am not prepared to involve myself in a position where I should have to give a judgment.
With the figure of Archbishop Fisher, we find ourselves moving into a very different landscape. Fisher is absolutely determined to face and to explore fully and efficiently what it is to have a Church of England in the context of the post-war world as a society that's readjusting, redeveloping, migrating often, and achieving new organisations, new government departments, new policies for a society that's capable of actually improving itself. He wants a church that is organised, efficient, responsive to society at large, is able to deal with anomalies and backward-looking traditions that may no longer serve. All of this might look very good to a figure like Brian Hession, but at the same time, Fisher is someone who looks to organisational structures to give a clear definition and coherence to what's happening. And in that sense, Hession is rather an outsider.
The church continued to be unreceptive to Hession's ideas, and over the next 2 years the Reverend's cinematic aspirations would not only fail to materialise, his entire world was about to crumble. In 1948, Reverend Hession's marriage ended. Brian also continued in his efforts to create a formal position within the church hierarchy for his film work. Archbishop Geoffrey Fisher, having replaced William Temple after his untimely death in 1944, would become the third Archbishop of Canterbury to have Hessians solicit their patronage. Fisher penned his response in a deliberate manner and had no intention to address film on a piecemeal basis.
Quite apart from the fact that I am no particular judge of films, I am not prepared to involve myself in a position where I should have to give a judgment.
With the figure of Archbishop Fisher, we find ourselves moving into a very different landscape. Fisher is absolutely determined to face and to explore fully and efficiently what it is to have a Church of England in the context of the post-war world as a society that's readjusting, redeveloping, migrating often, and achieving new organisations, new government departments, new policies for a society that's capable of actually improving itself. He wants a church that is organised, efficient, responsive to society at large, is able to deal with anomalies and backward-looking traditions that may no longer serve. All of this might look very good to a figure like Brian Hession, but at the same time, Fisher is someone who looks to organisational structures to give a clear definition and coherence to what's happening. And in that sense, Hession is rather an outsider.
The church continued to be unreceptive to Hession's ideas, and over the next 2 years the Reverend's cinematic aspirations would not only fail to materialise, his entire world was about to crumble. In 1948, Reverend Hession's marriage ended.
Particularly at Christmas, there were arguments and tears and I suppose it happens in many families. Doors got slammed, and I seem to remember that we departed from the vicarage with my father and mother a bit earlier than was planned. His wife, Molly, was leading a very active life and relationships of various kinds, and I don't know whether you want to know this, but I'm told that the local GP was involved in a personal relationship, and this led to a scandal in Aylesbury, and I think was part of the reason that he then moved from. I think he stayed on in Aylesbury for a bit, but didn't continue as the vicar. This is the time when divorce, particularly vicars heading for divorce, was, quite an unmentionable scandal, yeah.
As a result, Reverend Hession was in a tough spot yet again. As a vicar in the Diocese of Oxford, Reverend Hession would report to the Bishop of Oxford, Kenneth Escott Kirk, which raised substantial issues for Brian. Bishop Kirk literally wrote the book on marriage and divorce in 1933 and issued a new edition of that book that very year, 1948, setting forth his views of church doctrine on the issue of marriage and divorce. These views were complex. Traditionally, of course, divorce was a major taboo, strictly forbidden by the church. By 1948, however, even for vicars, the dissolution of a marriage became somewhat more acceptable, though tenuously so. In a 1948 correspondence with another bishop, Kirk offered encouragement to a student who wished to continue to seek his path to be ordained, even though he had been divorced, as long as the divorce was handled with discretion. Bishop Kirk also sharply warned that if the student ever decided to remarry, his employment with the church should not be expected to continue. With the end of Reverend Hession's marriage a public scandal which could hardly be considered discreet, and as a young man who surely hoped to marry again, there seemed little future in the church for him. His choices were few.
Well, I think in the 1940s, Brian Hession is still caught within a church and within a society too, which has certain understandings of what a parish priest is supposed to represent. There is a gradual and often painful adjustment going on, not only within the church, but within society at large. So for a priest to be involved in divorce raises questions at that time. For many people, it's a question of pastoral effectiveness as well as actual principle. And I think this is something that will certainly have moved Brian Hession further out as far as the institutions of the church were concerned. Because it has to be said that in the Church of England at large, there's often not very much moral courage where a main line of policy, one might almost say, is seen to be threatened. An individual is widely regarded as something more dispensable.
There were other things going on in the Reverend's life that played into the matter. Hession continued to suffer what had been diagnosed as duodenal ulcers in the small intestine. He was required to take at least 2 leaves of absence during this period to recover, and the condition seemed to be worsening.
He was not better. In fact, he was worse. His pneumonia was followed by pains in the heart and a duodenal ulcer.
Additionally, Hession's film company Dawn Trust was looking increasingly promising, with trade agreements being reached for US movies to be distributed in the UK. Hession also planned to continue producing films of his own. Combined with his duties as a vicar and a broken marriage surrounded by public scandal, his life was growing quite difficult. In December 1949, Reverend Hession announced he was resigning his post as Vicar of Holy Trinity, Walton, stating that he had contracted duodenal ulcers in the digestive tract, as a result of overwork. He intended to spend his time at his cottage in Poole, focusing on the work of Dawn Trust Films, producing religious films for a widening audience, after convalescing in Italy with his friend Filippo del Giudice. Filippo del Giudice was an Italian film producer who'd fled Mussolini's Italy to London in 1933 and is one of the more colourful characters that Reverend Hession befriended during his roller coaster life. Del Giudice founded Two Cities Films with the philosophy of making better British movies, stating that he wanted to
give all the chances to the real talent. Let us fight for this ideal we shall enjoy much better than any money could ever offer, in pride and fun.
His philosophies seem to align well with those of Reverend Hession. Del Giudice produced such well-known films as Hamlet and Henry V, starring Laurence Olivier, and which each won Oscars for Sir Lawrence. Nevertheless, the films were extremely expensive to produce, and Del Giudice was forced to sell a controlling interest to Arthur Rank. The Rank organisation soon clamped down on budgets and Del Giudice's creative freedom. He soon attempted to start a new production company and served as the administrator or presenter for a few movies. The financial challenges proved overwhelming. By the time Reverend Hession joined his friend at his long-term residence at Italy's prestigious Excelsior Hotel in Rapallo, Del Giudice described himself as
broken, desperate, and exhausted.
The hotel was exquisite, and Del Giudice was receiving many glamorous visitors such as Ingrid Bergman, Roberto Rossellini, and Peter Ustinov. But Reverend Hession did not stay long. The pains in his stomach were too severe to endure, and he returned early to London. Once back in London, Brian submitted his resignation to the church, which was accepted on the 20th of April 1950. Molly Hession moved on. She married Stephen Henry Carnelli in 1952, a former Olympian runner who was educated and taught at Oxford University. Molly took her new husband's last name, and together they relocated to Naivasha, Kenya, where Stephen had a family home known as Hippo Point. Rumours of further adultery and drinking followed Molly into Kenya, but her family remembers her as a strong, independent woman who loved fast cars and fast horses. She was not afraid to pull out a rifle to scare away curious hippos that threatened her gardens. A woman described as someone who wore trousers and never skirts, and walked with a pronounced limp and cane that never slowed her down. It's clear that she was a woman determined to follow her dreams wherever they led her. In an odd twist, Molly Carnelli would later appear briefly in Africa Addio, a film directed by infamous Italian directors Gualtiero Jacopetti and Franco Prosperi. Along with the 1962 film Mondo Carne, Africa Addio was the foundation for the Mondo film movement, a series of shocking documentaries, later known as shockumentaries, filmed around the world. Africa Addio depicted the aftermath of the failed Mau Mau revolution in Kenya and the supposed crumbling of the British colonial structure there. Molly, her husband Stephen and their family are seen presiding over the auction of their family estate. According to her family, though, the filming was a staged mock-up choreographed by the directors, and the family has maintained Hippo Point up until the present day. As the weariness of the immediate post-war years drifted purposefully into the cautious optimism of the 1950s, life could not have been very easy for Reverend Hession. He'd resigned his position at his beloved church and was back in the small coastal town of Poole, in the cottage which he'd shared with his now former wife and where he produced his 1946 film Letter from Goathorn. With his son in boarding school and his daughter having followed Molly to Kenya, Reverend Hession was truly alone. It would have been easy for a man like Brian, no longer able to preside over a parish, to remove himself quietly into anonymity and solitude, to spend the rest of his days in the little coastal town preaching here and there. Or he could move to Hollywood and never return. Maybe his film script would sell one day. He'd wash away the past alone, hiding from the stigma, like so many other lost angels in a city filled with them. But the Reverend was not one to hide from the stigma or depression that can arise from solitude. Can we ever thank God for loneliness? The Reverend would ask later. I think we can, he concluded. Loneliness will never let us rest until we find a new life. It whispers voices that will lead us on to new achievements, new activities, new growth. All these new efforts to fill the void. Loneliness is not a byproduct, but a grief all to itself. It is a well to be filled very quickly with a kind of occupational therapy before we fall into it and drown. The Reverend certainly lived the way he preached. He immediately focused on working, entering into agreements with James Friedrich and his American company Cathedral Films to distribute American religious films in the UK. The Anglo-American trade agreement was in full effect, requiring high tariffs on US films distributed in the UK. Hession, so passionate about religion and film, was showing himself to be an astute business person and did very well in negotiating the obstacles and bureaucracy required to pass muster under the agreement.
I think in that sense his move away from parochial life into the pursuit of a particular vocation was acceptable, though, across the church. That Hession has moved into a particular area away from that broad pastoral work into something where he can continue without embarrassing either people or principles to pursue a real Christian vocation as a priest.
Soon Reverend Hession found himself in love again, and in 1952 married Catherine Rowland Thomas. The two were married quietly. The couple held their small ceremony at St Martin in the Bullring in Birmingham, presided over by Canon Brian Green, an old friend of Hession's. Canon Green was one of the few clergymen at the time who would marry a divorced person with a spouse still living.
Canon Brian Green is one of the most remarkable and one of the most justly famous parish priests of the Church of England in this period of the 20th century. He's a pastoral priest of some authentic genius. The kind of Protestantism that Brian Green represented offered more room for manoeuvre, more room for compassionate pastoral understanding, and was in many ways essentially forward-looking.
The couple soon began preparations for a sea adventure to New York on the Queen Mary, followed by a road trip across America with a final destination of Los Angeles, where Brian had secured a job as technical producer for a new big-budget religious movie for Cathedral Films and his old friend James Friedrich. Day of Triumph was to tell the story of Jesus Christ in full technicolor and without any hesitation or qualms as to depicting the figure of Christ. It wasn't Hession's script and he wouldn't be directing, but technical producer was a step further up in the hierarchy than film distributor, and it was closer to the inner workings of Hollywood than he had ever been. The Hessions arrived in New York on May the 1st, 1954. The couple acquired a new Chevrolet Bel Air and made the open road their home for a while, stopping at various churches to preach the message of Christianity through film, evangelizing religious film as a new and exciting way to reach congregations of a size not previously imagined. The trip took the couple across the landscape of America. They stopped in many different cities, finding places to preach, often without a fee, just room and board for a few nights. Travelling preacher and filmmaker was an occupation in which Brian took great pride.
Religious travelling showmen, they would go around and just set up shows, or you might have somebody like a Sunday school might book somebody who has a career. Their career is to go around various Sunday schools that have booked them and show their films. And that tradition of travelling showmen comes really from the very early period. The very early film pioneers in the 1890s.
Brian and Catherine's final destination was Los Angeles, where Reverend Hession's work on Cathedral Films' Day of Triumph would soon begin. The pair arrived in Hollywood just in time for the beginning of shooting on the film, which the Reverend would bless with his technical production skills and understanding of British religious thought. He firmly believed the movie would be a huge success in both the US and the UK and cement his name as a pioneer of religious films, an ambition he'd spent over 20 years pursuing with a ferocious vigour. The Reverend spent 8 weeks on the set and worked without salary or expenses to ensure that would bring more spiritual integrity to the film in the name of the British churches. Reverend Hession was delighted with the movie and its producer, James Friedrich. Day of Triumph fared modestly well with the critics and the public. By then, several big Christian movies had been made in Hollywood with significantly larger budgets, giving Day of Triumph a distinct B-movie feel.
You're the carpenter. No more. No longer will I labor with wood. Now my work is with mankind.
This new task you've undertaken, this work with men.
I bring them hope, new hope. For the kingdom of God is close at hand, and his forgiveness ready for all who repent and truly believe.
Moreover, much of the Hollywood gloss that Reverend Hession hoped to strip away from the story of Jesus seemed firmly in place, and the genre was later parodied by Mel Brooks in his classic satire, History of the World.
Stop. Could you please step on the same foot at the same time? My tits are falling off!
Although it's a truly heartfelt piece of work, Day of Triumph faded into relative obscurity, a Christian cult classic. But in Hession's eyes at the time, it was a step closer to his dreams of spreading his gospel through film. But soon enough, his film resume would be the last thing on Hession's mind. "1954 started auspiciously for Reverend Brian Hession and his new wife, Catherine. They travelled from London to America together, and together they drove a Chevrolet Bel Air across the United States, stopping at churches so Brian could preach and show his films to interested audiences. And to cap it off, Brian spent 8 weeks in Hollywood acting as a technical advisor on a big Hollywood movie. In his typical fashion, even after Day of Triumph wrapped, Reverend Hession continued to work without pause. He flew to Tyler, Texas at the invitation of the pastor of Marvin Methodist Church to preach and show films, including movies he produced displaying various coronation events the previous year. Though the services went well, on the aeroplane returning to Hollywood, he suffered another attack of pain in his abdomen, and it became too much to bear. He was rushed to hospital, and after a battery of tests, he demanded to know the diagnosis. In Hession's words, the doctor's reply was blunt and final. Like a judge proving his point, the doctor said, "You have the last and final stages of bowel cancer. It has been growing for years and clearly visible, like a cauliflower, only an inch from the surface and stretching way up inside. You've had a lot of pain with this thing over a long time. There's nothing we can do now, kid. Better put your papers in order quick." Hession was aghast to learn that the doctors believed he only had a few days to live and that an operation was out of the question, too late to do any good. Brian would later describe the news in grim prose. "If you can fall into a deep well of panic and fear in a split second, this was it. I tried in my mind to climb the walls to get out, but they were dark and greasy. I felt I knew these very walls from nightmares of the past. I had buried so many people during my life, and I wondered if they were really dead or if they wanted out of their coffin just to work a little longer."
It's hard to consider it now, but if we look back to the late 40s and early 50s, cancer was an unmentionable term. It was some hideous disease, untreatable, disfiguring, distressing for the person and all those around him.
Talk about cancer was not easy. The kind of treatments that are now available, therapies that are now available for the extending of life and so on, were less available. So, cancer really specified one thing, that was your looming death. So there was, it was spoken of in terms of the big C word. So not even the word was pronounced very often.
Almost immediately, he and his wife began searching for a surgeon who might be able to assist. His wife prayed not for Brian's direct healing, but that God help them find the right person for the job, God's instrument, as Hession saw it. After many frustrated phone calls, they managed to locate a surgeon willing to help. Dr. John Howard Payne was a surgeon who happened to be based near Los Angeles and responded to Hession's plea. "It's going to be tough going," Dr. Payne warned, "but we'll have a try." While Dr. Payne was a tremendously skilled and brave surgeon, the prognosis was not good. "You have got a time limit on your head," Dr. Payne direly concluded. There was no time to delay. Even in the best of circumstances, cancer was a cruel and ruthless adversary.
I look upon it not so much as disease, but a failure of the systems that normally regulate our cells. So in a normal person, your arms grow to the same lengths on either side. You produce enough blood to replace the blood you've lost. You produce enough skin to replace the skin you've lost. In cancer, what's happened is those normal control processes have been lost and disrupted. So you start to make too much of your bowel wall, or too much of your skin, or too much of your bone.
All the time, our cells are dividing from us as a fetus until the day we die. And every replication means the DNA is duplicated. So the little spiral unzips and duplicates itself. Billions of times in our lives. Billions of times. It's not surprising. Occasionally that goes wrong. Now we have mechanisms. We have mechanisms like apoptosis. So if a cell realizes it's gone down a wrong pathway, there is a self-destruction mechanism. There are supposed to be certain limits on this sort of thing happening. There are scanning of the DNA to make sure that there are no mutations, but every now and then one will break through. Now, a lot of time, those will, their daughter cells, that's fatal for them. They just don't make it the next division. But occasionally, that mutation will survive. And that is an intrinsic deficit. That's a weak point that perhaps on the next division, another mutation could follow. And eventually, certainly in colorectal cancer, and there's some lot of evidence that we now know how many mutations lead to a polyp, and then a polyp undergoes mutation and becomes an invasive cancer.
Well, bowel cancer arises usually in the lining of the bowel, and that's the part of the bowel that's coming into contact with the food or the waste material from the food. And one assumes that there are chemicals forming within our food or within the waste matter from our food which are inducing the cancer. So just in the same way, smoking produces tars that act on the lung and irritate the lining of the lung and cause cancer. So there are things in our food that are irritating us and causing it. We think that because if you look at the countries which have a high risk of cancer at the bowel, they're the countries that eat a particular diet. So they eat more red meat and drink more wine. Eskimos who eat fresh fish all the time don't get bowel cancer, and the omega-3 fatty acids in the fish seem to be protective. So if you eat lots of fish and avoid too much alcohol, then probably that's very protective. Hence a lot of the recommendations that are now being made about diet.
Brian's cancer was particularly advanced and aggressive, and his chances in surgery were not high. Nevertheless, the alternative was certain and imminent death. Reverend Hession quickly consented to surgery that would save his life or end it. Dr. Payne performed abdominoperineal resection surgery on Hession, colloquially known as the Miles procedure, an operation developed by William Ernest Miles in the early 20th century, and which was still somewhat controversial at the time, although it's now considered a gold standard by many surgeons.
So Miles, in developing his procedure for bowel cancer, was trying to actually cure people. And he knew that it was risky. It was risky because it was quite a big operation with liability to bleed and liability to get infection because you were dealing with all the septic material around the anus.
In Hession's case, the cancer was so advanced in development that it had caused an obstruction to arise into the bowels, creating further challenges for the surgery.
When patients present with bowel cancer, they sometimes present obstructed. You'd have thought the thing to do if you were obstructed was to go in, cut the obstructed bit of bowel out, join the bowel together, replumb it, and then get rid of the cancer and cure the obstruction. The problem is that where you'd stitch the bowel together, in that situation it often leaks. And it's still an issue even now. It still are the most feared complication that it will leak. Because the patient can then die from septicemia, and particularly in those days when you didn't have antibiotics against the bowel, that was inevitably fatal. So people tried to find safer ways to do it, and one of the ways they developed was where you did it in stages. So the first stage was you'd pull out a loop of bowel and raise a colostomy. You wouldn't try and take the cancer out. You just pull a loop of bowel out above the obstruction and relieve the obstruction. And then when the patient was stronger, you go back and now cut the cancer out, leaving that colostomy in place and rejoin the bowel. And then your third stage would be to go back in and then close the colostomy that you'd originally raised. So by breaking it up into smaller steps, which you did when the patient was well, then it made the whole procedure as a whole safer. Now in this case, in Reverend Hession's case, what they did was to take the tumour out and raise the colostomy all in one stage in an emergency situation. Now that's very brave and unusual surgery. Even now we would view that as brave and unusual surgery.
As a result, Brian's surgery was a marathon lasting over 6 hours, causing a substantial stress on his body. Of course, this was at a time when many modern technical advances were not available, and to that extent Dr. Payne was operating somewhat blindly.
When Brian Hession had his surgery, they wouldn't have had CT scanning. All they would have had would be the appearances that they saw before they started the operation, the appearances at operation. But they would have known that it seemed to be a large tumour that was aggressive and fixed, and from what he describes, the doctors were shocked when they saw the state of the tumour. So that might have encouraged them to be bolder when they operated to try and achieve clearance of the tumour, as they did indeed do so. These days we have scans, so we can see whether the lymph nodes are involved and whether there's a lot of lymph nodes. And if you find there are a lot of lymph nodes, then you might be inclined to take more of the lymph nodes with the tumour, and so you would change the surgery to make sure that you've got more of the lymph nodes. So you might change it now, but in those days you wouldn't have had those indices to tell you how to do your surgery. You just had to go by the physical appearance and what you saw.
Because of the advanced stage of Reverend Hession's cancer, it would mean living with a colostomy for the rest of his life. And in and of itself, the initial recovery from such major surgery was not easy.
Brian had a drain in for ages, which he found quite difficult. That sort of perineal wound takes weeks and weeks and weeks to heal. In this time, he's not going to be taking any oral food. So it's going to be intravenous hydration, but that time they wouldn't be doing intravenous feeding, which we would now. So he's only getting water and sugar and salt. So he'd have lost a lot of weight. Amazingly, we used to nurse these folks in, what were they called, tents. So they were lying on their back, but they had a sort of frame at the end of the bed, so all the covers and things were like on a tent over this bit. And the nurses would examine the perineum just to make sure everything was all right. And it was part of my job as a junior doctor, peer at it and make sure that, because the worry was you had some sutures very often, but you didn't try and close it completely. Closed it a bit round the drain, but not completely. And if a collection built up behind it and that got infected, then the whole thing could go quite fragile, but also painful and life-threatening. You know, to get an abscess with pints of pus, because the cavity is big, and he'd have had a catheter in, because however good you are, you're going to remove some of the nerves to the bladder, and there's a lot of bleeding and trauma to the back of the bladder, so you're going to find it difficult to pee.
Despite all of this pain and discomfort, Dr. Payne succeeded in removing the cancer and sufficient margins around the tumour to ensure the primary cancer would never return to that area of the body. It never did, and Brian refused to slow life down. Just 5 months after massive surgery, Reverend Hession was not only back on his feet, he was attending film openings, such as the one for the movie Holy Night, and was presiding over prayer, preaching at St. Michael's Church in Bournemouth on Christmas Day.
All power is given unto me in heaven and in earth. Go ye therefore and teach all nations.
He spoke in positive tones, and it was clear that he was determined to continue to work and fight. He spent much of 1955 recuperating and focusing on 2 new goals: writing the manuscript for a new book which he titled Determined to Live, and creating plans for a new cancer patient advocacy organisation called Cancer Anonymous. Like everything in Brian's life, things moved quickly. During this period, he also worked restoring Greystoke, an old hotel he purchased from his hospital bed while recovering from his surgery. Even in his weakened condition, physical labour did not seem to slow him down. He planned to open the new hotel as soon as possible, always thinking of the future, always working.
Greystoke was a beautiful manor house overlooking Poole Harbour, which belonged to the late Lord Lisle. And Brian Hession purchased it when he was in America, literally at death's door. And he turned it into a hotel. It was basically a hotel, but he also used to invite cancer-struck patients there for respite and care. And he used to hold seminars and meetings there about Cancer Anonymous. That was him. He was so determined. If he set his mind to something, he would go ahead and do it. And I think the thought that he had that helped him pull through, because he shouldn't have pulled through. He was so dramatically ill. But yeah, I think that helped. That gave him something to get back to Paul and get going with.
Cancer was certainly the most formidable adversary the Reverend had confronted, but his fighting spirit was not to be deterred. Cancer was his new nemesis, and it had to be fought with the highest bravery, the Reverend was convinced, by a man with a showman's spirit. From this conviction, he would never falter. By November of 1955, Hession was scheduling Cancer Anonymous's first meeting. Reverend Hession saw this new endeavour as the biggest and most important one he would ever introduce to the world, blending the spiritual goals and ethos of Alcoholics Anonymous with the real-world practicalities of modern-day oncology and science. At its core, it was designed to advocate for better treatment and resources for cancer patients, but perhaps even more fundamentally, it sought to counter the stigma of cancer. And the Reverend Hession dragged his still recovering body by train all the way from Poole to London, a 3-hour, very bumpy ride. And he sent invitations to many physicians, clergymen, bureaucrats and politicians. He invited the Minister of Health, who respectfully declined, but passed the invitation on to the Chief Medical Officer's department. The CMO's office were always interested in anything regarding the controversial subject of cancer. The Chief Medical Officer was Sir John Charles, but he delegated this particular task down the chain of command. The invitation was distributed to his Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Neville Marriott Goodman. Not unlike the exchanges Hession shared with Chaplain Don regarding religion and film 20 years earlier, Brian found Dr. Goodman uninterested in an outsider interfering with the ministry's business. Instead, Goodman suggested that one of his advisors, Dr. A. Cruikshank, attend, but to do so with much discretion.
If convenient, it would be useful if you could attend. It would be better not to write beforehand. If you just turned up, I am sure you would be able to attend. Dress, ginger whiskers and fake nose.
Nothing further was heard until July 1956, 7 months later, when the Reverend sent a reader's copy of his new book, Determined to Live, to the Chief Medical Officer's department. In a note that seems almost Victorian in its gossipy tone, Dr. Goodman's secretary, Miss Heath, forwarded the book to Cruikshank with the seemingly snide comment,
"If you attended the meeting in January, you may, as a staunch supporter, be interested in this book."
Hearing nothing back from the Chief Medical Officer, the Reverend Hession continued his mounting campaign to secure the support of the Ministry of Health. In late 1956, he forwarded a proposed educational literature pamphlet to the ministry, stating that he hoped you like it enough and pull your influences to get copies into every hospital, LEA and doctor's office.
So this was what Brian proposed in 1957, and all of them are current now, all of them. So these are embodied in the 2-week wait rules. So, for example, a lump or thickening in the breast or elsewhere, that would immediately mean a GP referred the patient to a breast service under the 2-week wait rule. But certainly these are all built into current guidelines. These are red flags, and he's actually printed them as red flags. So I think that he was spot on there, absolutely spot on with all of them.
The pamphlet, which in hindsight seems accurate and rather innocuous and straightforward, received no response from the ministry. Hession also sent a copy of his new book, Determined to Live, to Dr. Goodman. The book was a memoir of sorts, but really it was a great deal more than that too. He spoke openly about cancer and the pain and indignities that went along with it. He urged change in the process, citing scientific studies and naming experimental drugs that could offer at least hope to cancer patients. It put a name and face to the disease that previously was rarely discussed. Cancer patients were mostly kept in the dark, but to Reverend Hession, darkness was where pain and weakness festered. And it was this darkness that the Reverend was determined to battle.
One of the things that's so striking about Hession is he is really doing this before almost anybody else. So he's challenging these horrible silences around cancer, death and grief before almost anybody else in this country at that time. He'd suffered cancer himself and had written about it and had become really the first sort of celebrity cancer campaigner. He's the first person to write a sort of celebrity memoir about cancer and struggling with the diagnosis, and also about other people dying from it.
A lot of illness is to do with
feeling isolated. And that's why it's so important for the visitation of the sick to be, kind of still high on the kind of pastoral agenda of any kind of parish and any Christian community.
15 years prior to Hession's release of Determined to Live, famed writer C.S. Lewis released The Problem of Pain, in which Lewis argues that pain and suffering are not alone sufficient to warrant disbelief in God.
He's doing exactly the same thing as Brian Hession, although not in precisely the same way, which is bringing both sort of Christian understandings of death and God, and also sort of contemporary psychological and psychoanalytic ideas to try and grapple with emotions and feelings that have become almost unspeakable.
Yet Lewis was careful to preface his observations with the notation that the only purpose of the book is to solve the intellectual problem raised by suffering. The far higher task of teaching fortitude and patience, I was never fool enough to suppose myself qualified. Writing in his hospital bed on the edge of death and suffering intense pain and fear, Hession had no compunction about discussing this high task of fortitude and the practical logistics of pain. Hession wrote, "Strange is this business of pain, for there is always a struggle to keep it out of the mind and only in one part of the body. Now that I knew the end was so very near, the difficulty was that while giving with the pain instead of pushing against it, I had to gather up the reins of life at the same time, lest I should relax and let life itself slip away." When C.S. Lewis released The Problem of Pain, he asked that it be published anonymously, and when Lewis published a similar book, A Grief Observed, in 1961, he initially published it using a pseudonym. Although it was certainly difficult, Hession did not display any hesitation to consider and dissect publicly every element of pain and grief.
It doesn't come naturally to them either, it's still a struggle. And also they draw on psychological ideas. Both C.S. Lewis and Brian Hession use quite secular psychological language. They talk about feelings and healing and emotional health in a way that suggests that they're in the kind of conflict in a way between a Christian and a secular understanding of what they're trying to articulate.
Such lofty concepts were perhaps more than the Ministry of Health had an interest in considering at that time. When Dr. Goodman received a copy of the book from the Reverend, forwarded on by the Ministry of Health, he seemed bemused, asking the ministry,
"For heaven's sake, advise me what to say."
Determined to Live and Cancer Anonymous were both lauded internally by some experts within the ministry, including Dr. Goodman's expert Cruikshank. Dr. Goodman, however, declined Hession's request to provide official support for either the book or the organisation. Hession seemed to be headed for some more dead ends. Unbeknown to Reverend Hession, though, Cancer Anonymous's leverage would soon improve substantially. In January 1957, he was a surprise guest on the popular British television show This Is Your Life, where old friends, including his cancer surgeon Dr. Howard Payne, were present. Hession was initially embarrassed and angered by the surprise, writing to the BBC and complaining that he was tricked into a television appearance when he was told he would appear on a radio show to debate the cancer issue. He was also angered that he was not provided time to convey properly the goals of Cancer Anonymous. His trademark relentlessness once again paid off, and he was provided a short slot in a flashback series of the show 6 months later. His message was reaching the masses.
Well, I must admit that it was a bit of a shock at first when one mind was full of other things to see you in a lighted corridor. And the thing I really regret most is that I didn't have a chance of saying certain vital things about cancer to the people.
Well, now, I know that you had a lot on your mind that night. Which things in particular was it that you would like to have said?
Well, first of all, that cancer is not infectious or contagious in any way, and that people should not avoid cancer patients, that it isn't hereditary, we shouldn't let children worry, and that cancer can be cured or endured.
I think cancer is curable or endurable. I think that's a very good summary. And more cancers are curable now than they used to be. And that we should endeavour to make as many as possible curable rather than endurable, and which I'm sure was also his ambition, and to some extent has come.
While Reverend Hession enjoyed a growing audience for his ideas, all was not well. In July 1957, the same month that he appeared on the flashback of This Is Your Life, he confided in a personal correspondence with Eleanor Roosevelt that the cancer had reached his right lung, which may need to be partially or fully removed depending on how fast and how big it grew. This was not good news, as it indicated that metastasis had occurred and that the cancer had moved from Brian's bowels to other parts of his body.
So if we look at the this bowel cancer and talk about the metastases from the bowel cancer, then when we're treating it, we're both trying to eradicate the disease locally, so in this case in the pelvis, and also prevent spread to elsewhere in the body.
Local cancer confined to the bowel is curable. Local cancer confined to regional lymph nodes is curable nowadays with surgery and adjuvant chemotherapy. Even now, spread to other organs is rarely curable.
So one assumes that they were very tiny deposits, just a few cells at the time of the original surgery, and then they gradually grew up. Maybe the body had kept them in check a bit. Sometimes there's a suggestion of that there's a reaction against them when you try and keep them down, and then they come to the fore for some reason when the body's weakened.
As usual, Brian was relentless. He impressed Dame Enid Russell-Smith, Deputy Secretary of the NHS, with Determined to Live, and she contacted Goodman to suggest he meet Reverend Hession. In frustration, Goodman finally conceded to see the Reverend.
I am quite willing to see the Rev if he wants.
With the loyal Dr. Cruikshank by his side, Dr. Goodman met with Reverend Hession for over an hour, or rather claimed to listen, as Dr. Goodman glossed over most of Reverend Hession's points, particularly his desire to see cancer treated as a speciality. Rather, Goodman seemed more interested in preparing for a battle.
We are going to have a bit of trouble with the Rev and his supporters.
In a draft response to the Reverend's letter, Goodman wrote a short but telling note in one of the margins and directed it to his secretary, Miss Heath, who had joked about Hession's book the previous year.
Perhaps a special file should be opened on our reverend friend.
10 days later, a new file was created at the ministry on Reverend Hession and Cancer Anonymous. The opening entry was signed by none other than the loquacious Miss Heath. The urgency of Brian's spirit perhaps arose from the fact that a spot had been noticed on x-rays of his right lung, and he and his wife had little choice but to watch it grow and hope it didn't grow large enough to require surgery.
If it's blood spread, it's going to end up in the lungs, because that's where the finest meshes, if you like. So that's the root bite. So you've got a cancer in the rectum, manages to send some cells, and cells don't survive very well in the blood. So kills off most of them, but some manage to survive, and they manage to end up in the lung, and then they start to acquire, then they send little messages to the local blood vessels, I'm here, send me a little blood vessel, oh yes, thank you very much, and they start to grow in the lungs.
Now these days, what this means is we do the surgery and we look carefully at the tumour and we do x-rays, and then if we think it's right, we give chemotherapy as well. Sometimes we even give the chemotherapy before the surgery. But when this surgery was done for the Reverend Hession, the ability to see if the tumour had spread elsewhere was much more limited. But they would still be wanting both to prevent the disease locally, and they achieved that because that was a terrible thing for him to have this painful, awful business going on in his pelvis. And it was wonderful the way they managed to cure that and treat that. But then they had the much more difficult task of trying to cure the disease which had already spread through the bloodstream and had cropped up elsewhere. And there, surgery to the lungs or to the liver can be helpful. But in those days, because it was so risky, there was very little liver surgery done.
Throughout 1957, Reverend Hession continued to send letters and brochures to Goodman and the CMO's office. One pamphlet, confidently entitled Victorious Case Histories and emblazoned with the Cancer Anonymous motto, "Cancer can be cured or endured," emphasised the stories of patients who experienced good results with various cancer treatments. In an attached note, Goodman scrawled, "I think the cured cancer pamphlet is an excellent idea." His sarcasm is unmistakable. Never missing an occasion to go directly to the top, Reverend Hession wrote to various members of Parliament, including Richard Pennington, Frederick Ferry-Jones and Dennis Vosper. He was promised a meeting with Vosper, and although the ministry prepared many pages of notes in readiness for the discussion, the meeting never materialised. At this stage, Brian had had enough. In stinging words in correspondence to Vosper, Reverend Hession sounded more like a Mississippi fire breather than a priest of the Church of England. As you of course know, the need for reforms are a positive scandal in Britain, and only our old school tie succeeded in covering the matter up. Luckily, modern publicity of media and TV and an informed public are tearing that tie to bits, and no Minister of Health can avoid giving audience to suffering humanity, grief-stricken relatives and ex-patients. The Reverend went further, continuing, "I do not envy you having to come out into the open yourself and tell Parliament what we have known for a long time, namely that concentrated cigarette smoke is creating cancer as regularly as clockwork, when we know that the cigarette tax revenue pays for almost the whole national health system. You must be in a terrible fix not to give out justifiable distortion of the truth. But I'm not so concerned with the ass of a chain smoker as with the fact that we as a nation have no national policy towards cancer." The connection between smoking and cancer must have resonated particularly deeply with the Reverend Hession. His thirst for government assistance in destigmatising cancer must have been fuelled at least in part by the fact that cigarettes had been promoted and smokers exploited since he was a child, with the government's acquiescence. Indeed, cigarette cards, widely collected at the time by both children and adults, themselves almost depicted a tableau of Hession's life. Sets included portraits of almost every person that had influenced him or guided him: Bishop Taylor Smith, Joyce Cooper, Canon Gillingham, Archbishop Lang, Chaplain Alan Don. Even his old boarding school, St John's Leatherhead, was turned into a collectible advert for the tobacco industry. This was all wrong in Reverend Hession's eyes, and it must have offended him greatly that the government seemed not only disinterested in investigating the link, but worse, determined to staunch any such inquiry. This was completely contrary to the ethos instilled 30 years earlier by Bishop Taylor Smith.
"It is our duty to enquire and search for that which we do not understand."
And of course cancer is a bigger threat now than ever, in the sense that I think it's widely acknowledged that as much as half the population is going to experience some connection, either personal or vicarious, with cancer, and therefore in that sense you can argue surely that Hession is prophetic, because he's not simply identified something that was always there and is important and hasn't been discussed with the fullness that might be helpful. He's actually seen something that is really coming, and I think that is such a powerful context in which to place him. I mean, I think that the cinema stuff, you can see that he is part of a mix and is a significant part of it, and he's out there on the frontier and he's taxing just how far it can be pushed out. But at the same time, I think what he achieves as a man through illness is astonishing.
In spite of his illness, the Reverend Hession seemed more energetic than ever. Billboards promoting his new book were installed throughout London, and on a wider scale his energies were fuelled by his popularity after This Is Your Life and the increasing support from politicians and celebrities. And through these various endorsements he found another medium to help spread his message: radio. Between April 1958 and August 1961, Hession appeared 24 times on the BBC, on popular shows such as Silver Lining and Lift Up Your Hearts, speaking frankly of his illness and counselling against fear and stigma.
And he is a pioneer, really, in that respect. He's a very early example of someone explicitly criticising the stiff upper lip ethos and saying this might have been appropriate in the past, but it is harmful, it's unhealthy, it is wrong. And he does that particularly in connection with questions about grief and death, and particularly people dying of cancer. So he's really a pioneer of a slightly softer, perhaps psychologically more healthy approach to tears in the 1950s.
In June 1958, the Reverend publicly disclosed to an Australian journalist that he would be having his lung removed, an operation that he'd anticipated for a while. He told the journalist that he'd promised the BBC he would recuperate from the operation in time to make his scheduled radio appearances through August.
Once it was realised that somebody had lung metastases, the scenario is that somebody with bowel cancer develops lung metastases. Very often that's a very end-of-life situation, because they've also got liver metastases and they've got peritoneal metastases, and even if you remove the lung, you're not going to cure them. So historically, it was a no-no. You didn't do a lung operation, but you're in a transition period here where these guys have been removing lungs, doing lots of operations for TB particularly, and beginning to do operations for lung cancer, beginning to remove lungs for lung cancer. And I think their initial response with somebody with a cancer in their lung would be, let's just remove it.
One of the few surgeons willing and competent to operate on the lungs and lung cancer was Sir Clement Price Thomas. He agreed to operate on Hession's lung tumour, although the likelihood of success was not high.
In those days, there weren't many thoracic surgeons around, so he was quite a rare breed. And the fact that he famously operated on the Queen's father is indicative of the esteem in which he was held. And it's a time when chest surgery, I would have thought, would be extremely dangerous because of the problems of getting the lung going again without antibiotics and all the rest of it. So, no, he was an impressive and brave surgeon.
Just 2 weeks after his right lung was removed, the Reverend kept his promise and made 7 radio appearances between July and the end of August. In his typical positive fashion, the Reverend joked that, "I now know what Adam felt like when he had a rib removed for Eve." The radio shows were extremely popular.
The rector is expected to be a good visitor, a good preacher, a good organizer, a good writer of parish magazines, good with children, and in fact good with everyone.
It's particularly significant that Hession could do this on the BBC in 1958. I mean, then as now, the BBC is this great British institution and in a way stands for this rather reserved British kind of style, certainly in the 1950s. But more than that, in 1958 the BBC has a monopoly on broadcasting, on radio and television. And so you really were speaking to the nation. Not everyone would tune in to a religious broadcast on BBC radio, but millions of people would. And so when Brian Hession spoke on a programme like The Silver Lining or Lift Up Your Hearts, these religious programmes, he would have a very big audience. And so it was significant to be able to get his messages about emotions and tears and grief across to such a big audience.
Reverend Hession's condition continued to deteriorate despite his innate determination to live.
So you can't get a recurrence in the right lung because it isn't there. But there's an implant in the chest wall. And even now what you'd do, you'd either radiate that or you'd scrape it out.
Through it all, he fought hard to keep up public appearances, going so far as to ski at St. Moritz just 6 months after having his lung removed, making public appearances both in the US and the UK. He published books which included musings on Christianity and thoughts on life in general. Medicine and healing were consistent themes in Reverend Hession's writings. He spent hours dictating the books, going over various drafts until his points were crystal clear.
Yes, well, in those days we didn't have dictaphone machines. It was the old-fashioned shorthand notebook. I didn't sit on his lap. And we would just sit down for hours and he would dictate, and then I would type it back in double spacing, and then he would make amendments and adjustments, and then it would come back to me and I'd retype it again, probably 2 or 3 times. And then eventually we'd get the final script and sent it off to the publisher. No one who has visited hospitals and homes for the incurable to any extent could fail to be amazed at the persistent courage and bravery of so many ordinary people. Often these people are stripped of all that the world holds dear in the way of possessions. Their illness or their accident has often led to the loss of money, position and home. Their future is stark and bare, and may hold for them months of years of illness and possibly lifelong restrictions. You would imagine that they would whine and wince under the yoke that we might think was too heavy to be borne, yet so many of them show the most wonderful cheerfulness. They have the most inspiring philosophy of making the best of their circumstances. Is it to be wondered at that so many people in such a predicament have found comfort and relief in their religion, in their belief in God and His presence with them? Don't let us sneer and say that they only turn to God when they are ill. Thank God there is a God for people to turn where there is nothing else left in life, and when the human spirit might otherwise be expected to wilt and whine.
Even this third operation did not slow Reverend Hession for very long. Arthur Dixon Wright, Vice President of the Royal College of Surgeons, publicly took the position that cancer patients should never be told their diagnosis. Hession immediately dissented, arguing that lies breed distrust, and that while Dixon Wright was a first-class surgeon, he was a jolly bad psychologist.
He was very famous. He was technically extremely good, and he used to do bizarre things where he used to do ward rounds at 10 o'clock at night after dinner parties and things of that sort. So I think he was probably technically a very good surgeon, and he was careful about his patients, but he was very self-opinionated. He was your sort of archetypal surgeon, arrogant, very effective, very articulate, striding in and just doing what he liked and striding out again.
And soon Brian was debating the issue of patient disclosure with medical journalists from the German magazine Der Spiegel, fiercely defending the need for the patient to have full information.
I would say is if you've lied to the patient once, how do they ever know to believe anything else you say to them? So if you say, I don't think it's cancer, when you know perfectly well it is, then they never know to trust you for anything else, do they?
He recounted personal stories, and that after his bowel surgery in 1954, his wife and doctor had withheld from him the fact that X-rays had been showing possible signs of cancer in his lungs as early as 1955. The reason given was that they wanted him to enjoy his Christmas. He recalled in the interview that this bothered him greatly. Hession declared in the German language interview that because of the deceit, he did not believe anything anymore. The interview spread over 10 pages of the magazine. Even in his illness, or in part because of his illness, Hession was intellectual and unyielding, reflecting that cancer is, among other things, operated on. One cuts out the outer visible symptom of an internal cellular disorder, but you have not taken out the root of the evil. At any time, daughter tumours, the metastases, can occur in other parts of the body. The patient is still at risk. He is on call for the rest of his life, always under strict medical supervision. But how can you adequately monitor the patient after surgery if you tell him lies? It was a modern and progressive argument, still debated today, and one to which the medical journalists at Der Spiegel had difficulty responding.
And to some patients it might be appropriate. If you've got somebody of 88 who's dying with disseminated cancer, just saying, well, you must understand you're dying of disseminated cancer is not very kind. And then saying, you know, I'm sorry, I'm not sure we're going to be able to help you with this problem, might be a more compassionate and honest way to deal with an 88-year-old. So you could see at one extreme it might be appropriate. But when you've got an articulate, intelligent person who does understand, are you entitled to take the same line? No, I don't think you are.
Hession left the interview with his most critical point firmly intact. Patients must be able to trust their doctors, and therefore doctors must be fully transparent with their patients. As the cancer continued to spread its tentacles through Hession's body, the root of the evil, as he would say, he reached out to Jonas Salk, famed for his world-changing polio vaccination. By this time, Dr. Salk had pivoted away from polio into searching for a cure for cancer. Dr. Salk agreed to help, sending a regimen for an experimental drug to the Reverend's physician to administer to him, to be followed by 3 weeks of primitive radiation treatment prior to further surgery. There is no indication that this experimental treatment had any significant positive effect on Reverend Hession, and his condition continued to decline. In correspondence with his personal secretary, Brian reflected on the pain and that his hopes of recovery seemed to be declining. The treatment is not getting to the roots of the pain in the liver, Hession wrote mournfully, and they begin to realise it. Remarkably, just 1 month after this intense radiation treatment, Reverend Hession travelled to the United States again, preaching to a large congregation at All Saints Episcopal Church in Los Angeles. The trip was a short one, and he was soon back in London, sending out holiday cards and telephone greetings instead of in-person well wishes. Through it all, Hession remained positive, and in his 1960 book, Alone to Pray, he included a prayer he wrote especially for doctors and surgeons. Not that he be cured by some divine intervention, but that his surgeon would have the skill and courage to help Brian be cured and heal.
And it's based upon James 4, verse 10. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up. Let us pray. O God of love, I thank thee for all those who give themselves to thee in service of their fellow men and women, those who have to tend the sick and operate on other people's bodies. Grant to them a clear vision, a right judgment, and great daring as they seek to heal and cure those who are sick. Give to them the tact and love which may inspire confidence, especially as they deal with those who are forlorn and outside the reach of ordinary people. And this I ask through Jesus Christ, my Lord. Amen.
So one of the questions that this story raises is, can the patient themselves affect the outcome of their disease? And I, having spent a lifetime in medicine, would say sometimes. I mean, I think there are some unfortunate people who desperately want to live and do everything right, and yet still the cancer is too much for them. But I think in this case, Reverend Hession illustrates a number of ways in which patients can affect their own outcome. So firstly, he complied with the surgeon. So the surgeon came along and said, this is a huge operation, but I think I can save it. And he said, go for it. So that's, I think he trusted his doctor. And you see patients who don't trust their doctor. And then he got on with life. As you say, he got up and about quickly. And we see people who just sit in the corner and don't do anything and then get a thrombosis. And you see people who don't take enough nourishment in, and that's important in healing up. So he obviously got on with that. He also complied, presumably in the post-operative period, coughing and getting his chest clear. So that was all good. Now then, going forward, can you affect the development of metastases? And there is evidence that you react against the cancer cells, so that, and you see this where the cancer seems to have been kept in check for a long time. You see this with particular tumours like melanoma, where people can live with the tumour for years and then suddenly it gets a hold when some other factor comes along, which implies that your body can suppress it. And one of the factors that can affect your immunity and your ability to fight things is your spirit and how you feel. That it's much more difficult to quantify. Now there's a mixture of factors that come into play here, but one of them is the spirit fighting against it. So I think it does play a part, and I think all of the factors here played a part.
Although Brian's faith and work ethic never faltered, the cancer continued to spread. About 18 months after his previous lung surgery, the cancer arose again in his chest, prompting a fourth surgery. Brian understood the peril of his condition. While staying in London for treatments, the Reverend was able to take walks occasionally, memorialising his vision for all time, using his trusty camera to take photos of various beloved sites throughout the city. It was the same camera he'd been using since his role as technical producer on Cathedral Films' Jarius' Daughter in 1946, 15 years earlier. The photos are immortalised in Hession's short film, London in Pictures. The city, seen through the Reverend's ailing eyes, is beautiful.
We went to see him at St Thomas's Hospital not many weeks, I think, before he died. And obviously at that stage I knew how serious his illness was, that the amount of massive surgery that he had. But anyway, when I knew that, or was told he hadn't much longer to live, I took Mary, my wife, or my fiancée at the time, to see him in St Thomas's Hospital, and overlooking the Thames with a view of the Houses of Parliament. He was calm, still quite strong and charismatic in his way of speaking and relating. He was interested to know all about my fiancée and what our hopes and plans were for the future. I think the nurses were very fond of him. I think he was very charming with them. I mean, it's a phrase, but he could charm the birds out of the trees when he wanted to and needed to. But he was gracious, and he knew obviously what was coming and accepted the inevitability, as we all have to, of death. So he wasn't distressed. I think they were managing him well. He looked pale and clearly unwell and lost huge amounts of weight. So he was quite drawn, but I think he remained a really gracious, courteous man till the end, and was not resentful or angry at his what would have been his premature death. Yeah.
In June of 1961, while in a public ward, the Reverend dictated diligently into his ever-present tape recorder. His tone in his final days is poetic and insightful, calm and resigned to his environment and to his fate. Old men cry out for the nurse, Hession observed. Bad cases just grunt and groan. Bashed-up teddy boys from the East End of London shout to one another with a humour that is hard to understand. In the end, he lay in St Thomas's public ward, not unlike his father's own last days at Knapsbury Lunatic Asylum, where an earlier, different disease was vulnerable to its own stigma. Amidst the suffering that surrounded him, the Reverend Hession stayed positive yet pragmatic. It's no good getting annoyed by your circumstances or demanding a place of peace to consider the spiritual condition of your soul, he declared. We have to take life as it comes and sort it out right where we are. As he lay dying in hospital amongst the East End teddy boys and the old men crying for the nurse, the Reverend dictated the last words he would publish. No matter how chaotic your circumstances, I hope that you can withdraw into yourself and argue with me over every page of this book. The Reverend Brian Hession succumbed to cancer on the 9th of October 1961. Brian's obituary labelled him as a crusader against cancer. It's a title that likely would have pleased him a great deal. And while Reverend Brian Hession's name and efforts may have been largely lost to the hand of time, his message and his mission never were. As the Bishop of Coventry wrote in the foreword to Reverend Hession's book, Determined to Live, courage is not confined to battlefields of war. Every hospital is a battlefield, and courage is to be found in every ward. The highest degree of courage is that which is demonstrated over a long period of time, that goes on going on. These ideals endure, rejecting stigma, advancing healing through inquiry, through challenge, through medicine, through science, through hope, through perseverance. And perhaps this, much more than anything else, was Reverend Brian Hession's true secret mission.
Cancer can be cured or endured. Cancer can be cured or endured. Cancer can be cured or endured. Cancer can be cured or endured.